Chapter 2261. At this moment, Luo Fan's heart skipped a beat. The itinerant cultivators, and even the disciples of the Tao Lords in his world group, suddenly woke up from their reincarnations. Countless memories surfaced in the hearts of the cultivators, allowing them to understand their true selves at an unimaginable speed. Their cultivation realms began to rise at an unimaginable speed. In the blink of an eye, almost all the cultivators who had their own world group had recovered their strength and cultivation. At that moment, waves of incomparably ferocious auras seeped out from the various worlds and spacetime, spreading in all directions. They overlapped and repelled each other, causing the auras of the entire cluster of worlds to be thrown into disarray. It was extremely chaotic. In that instant, all the worlds that could only block the advance of the rogue cultivators with their instinctive reactions regained their vitality, as if they had suddenly evolved from mindless beasts into intelligent, rational, and highly intelligent beings. Translator. Zephizi Editor. Dio Quinn. At this moment, all the worlds that could only block the advance of the rogue cultivators with instinctive reactions recovered their vitality, as if they had suddenly evolved from mindless beasts into intelligent, rational beings. The appearance of this change was like a bolt from the blue to the rogue cultivators who were trying their best to rush towards the Luo Fan world. It made them, who were already feeling extremely difficult, feel even more uncomfortable. The same power would have different effects in the hands of different intelligences. The difference between the two could even be as great as the distance between the heavens and the earth. It was like an embroidery needle. In the hands of an embroidery worker, it could only be used for embroidery. However, in the hands of a martial arts expert, it could be used to kill. In the hands of a cultivator, it could even be used to do anything in the world and perform the functions of an ordinary object. In the hands of an innate heavenly realm cultivator, it could even contain a world. Even an ordinary object like an embroidery needle was like that, let alone the powerful power contained within the world group and all the power contained within the world group. When its instincts were activated, it could also bring about a relatively powerful effect. However, this effect was many times weaker than when the master of the Cosmos group was in control of it. As such, at this moment, the itinerant cultivators who were heading towards the Luo Fan world group felt that the resistance ahead of them had suddenly increased by a few times. In the blink of an eye, his originally extremely fast speed had been completely slowed down. It was as if he was moving in slow motion. He would need to spend dozens of times more time to achieve the same result as before. He's afraid. That was what the rogue cultivators thought. The person they were talking about was naturally Luo Fan. To these rogue cultivators, they only had one enemy, and that was Luo Fan. Luo Fan was the only one controlling the countless world. Under such circumstances, the sudden increase in resistance in front of them meant that Luo Fan was trying to stop them. This had clearly given them a signal. That was, their actions were a threat to Luo Fan. This was the only reason why Luo Fan had acted to stop them. Under such circumstances, they were greatly encouraged and all of them looked excited. It was as if a little light had appeared in the pitch-black place in front of them. At the same time, in the Luo Fan world group, the rogue cultivators and the disciples of the Tao Masters who had just recovered began to understand the situation they were in. They were all shocked and furious. He actually played with our wills like this. How could he be so bold? The disciples of the Tao Masters roared furiously. As they roared, they broke free from the heaven, earth, world, and spacetime that had originally bound them, and descended into the void outside the world in an extremely ferocious manner. After their wills were played with, it was impossible for them to be gentle. At this instant, countless worlds, and spacetime had been completely destroyed, and it had almost affected Luo Fan's will, causing him to have no choice but to expend a great deal of effort to summon those worlds, and spacetime from the river of time once more, allowing these worlds to return to a complete and perfect state once more. In the eyes of the cultivators, this action was a provocation. For a moment, they even wanted to immediately destroy the heaven, earth, world, and spacetime that they had previously destroyed. Fortunately, these cultivators were not ordinary cultivators. They were all experts who had experienced countless trials and obtained countless fortuitous encounters. However, their rationality directly suppressed the various emotions in their heart. With a single thought, they completely suppressed the urge to destroy again. Then, they turned around and quickly rushed in the direction of the world group that they were familiar with. No matter what, this place was the enemy's world group. Here, they could not exert any of their advantages, and all of their disadvantages were extremely magnified. In such a situation, unless they wanted to commit suicide, staying here would be the worst choice. Obviously, none of the experts who had just recovered would be willing to commit suicide. Luo Fan did not stop them from leaving. In fact, he had allowed them to recover so that they could leave. Just like that, the cultivators moved at an extremely shocking speed. In the blink of an eye, they had already surpassed their limits and arrived in front of the world of consciousness that had caused these cultivators to go through a shocking test in the past. Even now, many of them had been replaced by their past selves. All the cultivators were still fearful of this world of consciousness. At this moment, they roused their strongest strength and blasted it at the world of consciousness. They forcibly blasted holes in the originally complete world of consciousness and directly charged out. In the blink of an eye, the world of consciousness seemed to have turned into a sieve. On the other hand, the cultivators had already passed through the world of consciousness and escaped from the sea of suffering that they thought they were in. Isn't this too easy? Some cultivators muttered. Even though the consciousness world was already behind them, they still couldn't believe it. They couldn't believe that they had already passed through the consciousness world and escaped from that terrifying cluster of world. Originally, although they thought that they had a chance of escaping from the world group and obtaining freedom, no matter how optimistic they were, they could not have imagined that things would go so smoothly. It was as if the barrier in front of them was nothing more than a thin piece of paper. They only needed to exert a little bit of force before the barrier was broken and they obtained their freedom. He must be plotting something. Some cultivators' eyes were filled with indescribable fear. Since things were so simple that it was beyond their imagination, it proved that either they were much stronger than they had imagined, or their opponents were deliberately letting them go. Evidently, given their identities as Fourth Tribulation experts, their control over their own forces had naturally reached the acme of perfection. How could they have a poor grasp of their own strength and underestimate it? Therefore, there could only be the second possibility. Their opponents were deliberately letting them go. Under what circumstances would their opponents intentionally go easy on them? Naturally, it would be more advantageous for them to leave the world group. In other words, their opponents were plotting something and were waiting for them to walk right into the trap. Should we go or not? This was the second thought that appeared in the mind of the cultivator who made this judgment. Go. Of course go. No matter what the plot is, returning to our own world group will definitely give us a stronger ability to deal with it than staying here. In an instant, he saw through the pros and cons and knew what he should do. Perhaps the other cultivators had already figured it out like this cultivator, or perhaps they did not think too much about it. Regardless of whether they figured it out or just followed their instincts, the final decision was the same. That was to leave the world group of powerful experts as far as possible and return to their own world group. There were countless world clusters around Luo Fan's world group, and all the cultivators had begun to flee from Luo Fan's world group. Therefore, soon, some cultivators began to return to their own world group and began to merge with their world group so that the power and strength of their world group could be reconnected with them, allowing them to regain control of the power of their world group and obtain a stronger resistance that was countless times stronger than before. It was also at this moment that these cultivators understood part of Luo Fan's plan. This place is still surrounded by the world of consciousness? This was a fact that these cultivators realized. They suddenly realized that the surface of their world group was still covered by that layer of world of consciousness. It was as if they were still in the world group of the powerful expert who schemed against them. How could this be? This is clearly my world group. Why is it covering the other party's creation? The cultivators who realized this were in disbelief. They did not want to believe what they sensed. They did not want to believe that after spending so much effort and thinking that they had escaped from everything, they still walked right into the trap and were still in the other party's control. As more and more cultivators entered their world group, this fact began to spread, and more cultivators learned about it. For a moment, an indescribable feeling of despair began to spread among the cultivators. It was as if a person felt that the house was too hot in the summer, so he left the room to cool down, only to find that there was no difference between the outside and the inside of the house. In fact, because of the sun, it was even hotter. One could imagine how hopeless this feeling was. This caused most of the cultivators to slow down. All of them began to doubt the meaning of their advancement and whether it was really necessary for them to return to their world group. As the cultivators regained their senses, they began to make contact with the rogue cultivators who were rushing toward Luo Fan's world group. Communication was born from this. As they conversed, the cultivators who managed to escape finally understood what was happening outside and why those cultivators were rushing toward the center of the vortex in such a hysterical manner. The rogue cultivators also understood why the power and might of the cultivators in front of them suddenly increased so much. The reason was not because their opponents felt that they were strong enough to pose a threat to them, so they stopped them. The rogue cultivators could not help but feel greatly defeated after this discovery. However, at the same time they also felt a sense of hope. That was, the strength of their side seemed to have suddenly increased by a lot. Moreover, the situation of the newly joined forces seemed to be much better than theirs. After all, their world group was still independent, and their own power was still autonomous. They would not end up like them, where the power of their own world group seemed to be vaguely restrained by the power of the entire world group. It was no longer complete, and they could no longer control it. Why don't you join us and attack the world group of that powerful being and destroy it completely? Some rogue cultivators suggested to the cultivators who had contacted them. Hearing this, the cultivators who had just escaped from Luo Fan's world group instinctively shook their heads. If attacking the world group of that powerful being was useful, they would have started long ago. Why would they still need to leave that world group? Why would they still need to fight against the rogue cultivators who were rushing inside? Facing the cowardly behavior of the cultivators, the rogue cultivators were furious. Fine. If you're not willing, then make way. Let us do it. Some rogue cultivators roared and ignored the other cultivators, charging straight toward Luo Fan's world group. Now that the cultivators had complete control over their own worlds, they naturally had no intention of stopping the actions of the rogue cultivators. Even if they did not resist, it did not mean that they would join the side of the enemies who persecuted them and persecuted those who resisted. Hence, they restricted the power of their own worlds one by one, opening up a path, allowing the many rogue cultivators to quickly rush towards Luo Fan's world group in the process. Without the obstruction of the world group, the rogue cultivators advanced at an unimaginable speed. In a flash, they had already gathered outside Luo Fan's world group, facing the huge world group that was like a beehive. At the moment when they were about to enter the world group, the rogue cultivators finally became a little nervous. Is this the source of our nightmare? The rogue cultivators had similar thoughts in their minds, and their gazes became conflicted. They had indeed acted disdainfully toward the fleeing cultivators, but those words were the advice of their comrades, after all. How could they not bear it in mind? Chapter 2262. All the rogue cultivators were filled with hatred for Luo Fan's world group. Even now, they could not bear to recall what they had gone through in the world group. Under such circumstances, all the rogue cultivators were extremely agitated as they faced the world group. Kill! In the end, a rogue cultivator's shout made all the rogue cultivators gather their wills and charge into the world group that was unimaginably vast like rain. Just like when the cultivators left the cluster of worlds, the consciousness world that they thought would cause them a lot of trouble did not obstruct them at all. They easily broke through it and charged into the cluster of worlds without even feeling any resistance. It was as if nothing had happened in the world cluster, maintaining the state they were in before they left, or even when they were imprisoned in the world, and the space-time. It was so calm, so peaceful, and so profound. Thinking of their pain and despair, the rogue cultivators' eyes turned bloodshot. Ferocious power and shocking might were constantly released from their bodies. They gathered into all sorts of strange forms and charged in all directions. Even the space between the world group could not withstand the attack. Under the attacks, all sorts of strange changes occurred, such as collapsing, distorting, reconstructing, or giving birth to all sorts of world, and space-time. The scene was so grand that everyone suspected that Luo Fan's world group would be completely destroyed in the next instant. The strength of these rogue cultivators was nothing in Luo Fan's eyes, but no matter what, they were still existences at the fourth tribulation level. If they truly unleashed their strength, the power they could display was enough to destroy any world. Even if Luo Fan's world group had endless world, and space-time, it was just a few more attacks for the rogue cultivators. In just a few dozen breaths of time, thousands of worlds, and space-time had been destroyed by their attack. The rogue cultivators could not help but feel excited at the sight. It was as if they had suddenly found a glimmer of hope in the endless darkness. "Come on! This world cluster can't stop us!" a rogue cultivator roared. Some of the rogue cultivators even called out to the cultivators outside, asking them to change their minds and attack this cluster of worlds together, taking care of it cleanly. However, the response they received was the sympathetic gazes of those cultivators. This kind of gaze caused those who sensed it to be secretly surprised, and they even had all sorts of suspicions. "Don't tell me he still has a backup plan." "No. That's impossible. His foundation has been damaged to this extent. It's impossible for him to reform the world like before." This was the thought that came to the minds of these rogue cultivators. With this thought in mind, they simply ignored the cultivators outside and focused even more on attacking the worlds, and space-time within the group of world. What happened next was just like in their most perfect dreams. It was unimaginably smooth. Those worlds crumbled in front of them. Worlds were destroyed one by one, space-time was destroyed bit by bit. In just a few hours, under the attack of an unknown number of rogue cultivators, more than half of Luo Fan's world cluster had been destroyed. The entire world cluster had turned into the central core and the vast expanse of ruins outside. The entire world cluster seemed to have turned into a remnant of the end of the world. At this point, even if the cultivators outside firmly believed that Luo Fan had various means to easily deal with the rogue cultivators, they could not help but be a little shaken. After all, the world cluster constructed by the creation power of the fourth level of the Tao Master's Path was incomparably closely related to the cultivators. It could even be regarded as the accumulation of all the cultivators' past history, corresponding to the cultivators' own experiences, memories, cultivation achievements, and so on. Under such circumstances, the damage to the world cluster was not as simple as the damage to a magic treasure or a treasure. Instead, it was the damage to one's past and cultivation achievements. If it was an ordinary damage, such as the damage to one or two worlds, it was naturally nothing to the owner of the world cluster. With their ability, through deduction, there was a great chance that they could retrieve those achievements and restore the world cluster. However, if the damage was too great and hundreds, thousands, or even hundreds of thousands of worlds, and spacetime were damaged, the cultivation achievements lost might even affect the stability of the cultivation realm of the owner of the world cluster. If that was the case, no matter how stable the cultivator's cultivation realm was, or how brilliant his means were, it would be difficult for him to recover. What was lost might be equivalent to losing it forever. Even if thousands of worlds were damaged, there would be such an outcome. At this moment, Luo Fan's world cluster had already been damaged to this extent. How many worlds had been lost? It might have been hundreds of billions, or even trillions. Even if they thought that Luo Fan was omnipotent and that the expert's means were so brilliant that they could not understand it, they could not believe that Luo Fan still had a chance to turn things around at this point. Just like that, the cultivators started to be tempted one by one. Perhaps we really have a chance to get rid of him. This was the wild thought that gradually appeared in the cultivators' hearts. Even if they knew that there was something wrong with this, they could not help but feel lucky. In addition, their situation was only slightly better than those itinerant cultivators. They were also in a terrible situation that they could not accept. Therefore, in the end, more and more cultivators followed the itinerant cultivators and charged into Luo Fan's world cluster. They began to attack Luo Fan's world cluster with greater and greater force. The closer it was to the core, the stronger the endurance of the worlds, and spacetime. The difficulty of destroying it was also getting higher and higher. Therefore, even if the number of cultivators participating in the attack kept increasing, the damage they were doing to Luo Fan's world cluster was also slowing down. In just a few hours, they had already destroyed more than half of Luo Fan's world cluster. However, as they continued to go deeper, they spent a total of 10 days and only managed to destroy more than half of the remaining core. At this time, the number of cultivators participating in the destruction had increased to almost 80% of the cultivators on the Tao Master's path. The remaining cultivators were only about 20% of the cultivators who had not participated in the destruction, and it was this portion of the remaining cultivators who were ready to make a move. They could change their original firm decision at any time and rush straight into the ruins of Luo Fan's world group to launch an attack on the core of the remaining world group. If I can still recover at this point, then I'll admit defeat. This was the deepest thought in the hearts of the cultivators at this time. The destruction of the world cluster in front of them was so great that even they could not believe it. It had long surpassed their original dream, the most perfect state. However, if they could not do anything to Luo Fan at this point, then they had no way to deal with Luo Fan. At that time, they could only admit Luo Fan's absolute position and let him do whatever he wanted. After a few years, when the remaining cultivators who could not resist changing their minds and completely joined in the destruction of Luo Fan's world cluster, the last remaining core of Luo Fan's world cluster was completely annihilated under the endless terrifying attack. In a time that was tens of thousands of times faster than their best estimate, all the cultivators on the 4th level of the Tao Master's path worked together and finally completely wiped out the entire world cluster of Luo Fan. They completely wiped out all the heavens and earth, all the worlds, and all the space-time in this world cluster. Now, there was only an endless expanse of ruins left in this place. The fragments of the heavens and earth, the fragments of worlds, the fragments of space-time, the remains of living creatures, the remains of magic treasures, the remains of power, the remains of divine abilities, the remains of power, the remains of waves, the remains of destruction. Everything turned into an unimaginably tragic scene that made countless cultivators on the 4th level of the Tao Master's path feel refreshed and bewildered. The ruins of the world cluster, it's over? A cultivator murmured with a strong sense of bewilderment in his eyes. The resistance was so smooth that it was somewhat unreal. At this moment, these cultivators began to doubt the authenticity of all of this. They wondered if they had overlooked something or missed something. It seems that it's not over, a cultivator said with some hesitation. That's right, it's not over. I don't feel like I've gained freedom." Some of the more rational cultivators said this with an indescribable sorrow in their eyes. As they began this process, more and more cultivators came to realize this frustrating and sorrowful fact. Even though it seemed like the world cluster of the expert who toyed with them had been completely destroyed, their situation did not change at all. They were still in a state of being restricted, shackled, and toyed with. They could not break free, and they did not have freedom. Perhaps, from the moment our world cluster was merged, this place was no longer his weakness. An itinerant cultivator who was mixed in with a group of worlds murmured. His face was filled with a sense of realization and despair. As he spoke, more and more itinerant cultivators showed the same expression. Among them was the itinerant cultivator who was the first to realize that he had abandoned his world cluster. In fact, compared to other itinerant cultivators, he was even more convinced of this reason. This was because he was still alive and well after abandoning his world cluster and allowing his world cluster to be destroyed by the enemy. He did not suffer any injuries at all at this moment. A figure appeared in front of the cultivators out of thin air. The figure looked very ordinary at first glance, but if any cultivator took a closer look and sensed it, they would realize that the figure seemed to contain all the mysteries of the universe. No matter what cultivation path the observer took, what race he was, or how he cultivated to where he was now, they could all see traces of their own existence on this figure. In other words, the figure almost completely contained all the cultivation paths of all cultivators, and all the mysteries that all cultivators had comprehended over the endless years. This feeling made all the cultivators feel extremely shocked. The various negative emotions that they originally had were instantly suppressed by various comprehensions. Their expressions became dazed, and they only knew how to look up at the figure with incomparable infatuation. That figure was naturally Luo Fan's figure. At this moment, his real body was still outside the vortex of creation force. He was still in the battlefield of the light of the universe and the emotional spacetime. What appeared inside the vortex, in the ruins of his world cluster, was only a projection of him. As for why this projection could make countless cultivators produce it, it had already contained all their cultivation paths and cultivation achievements. The reason was also very simple. It was because he had already absorbed all the cultivation achievements of countless cultivators through his own world cluster and turned them into nourishment for the growth of his world of laws. This allowed his world of laws to grow to a level that could now contain all their cultivation achievements. Luo Fan glanced at the countless disciples of the Tao Masters and independent cultivators and said indifferently, "I wonder if you have calmed down now, fellow cultivators?" His words were like the morning bell and evening drum, directly jolting all the cultivators who were originally infatuated with his figure back to their senses. The infatuation in their eyes quickly faded, and it was replaced by anger, hatred, and fear. Calm down? This is not a prank between friends. A cultivator seemed to have mustered up his courage and roared. Luo Fan smiled faintly and said, "Fellow cultivator, why did you hide yourself? As a fellow cultivator on the 5th level, I don't have the ability to imprison you right now." As he spoke, a strange wave swept past this cultivator. Instantly, waves of incomparably formidable energy fluctuations surged out from the cultivator's body. They swept out furiously in all directions, causing the surrounding space to distort. With this change, the cultivator's appearance began to change, and his aura began to swell wildly. In the blink of an eye, he had already grown from a normal 4th tribulation powerhouse on the 4th level of the Tao Master's path to a level that far surpassed a 4th tribulation powerhouse, and his appearance also changed from that of an ordinary young man to that of a middle-aged cultivator. Chapter 2263. This middle-aged itinerant cultivator had clearly regained his sanity and strength. However, he was actually hiding his strength completely, weakening his presence and hiding among the cultivators on the 4th level, pretending to be a part of them, after being caught by Luo Fan from the crowd of people, he was directly swept away and restored to his original appearance. The expression on the face of the middle-aged rogue cultivator was quite ugly. The other cultivators were even more dumbfounded. They did not recognize the middle-aged cultivator. However, the aura, temperament, and even the pressure from the unseen told them that this cultivator was countless times stronger than them. However, such a powerful existence had completely concealed himself and hid among all the cultivators, pretending to be a cultivator of the same level and strength as them. This situation had long since overturned their expectations of a powerful cultivator of this level. For a moment, all of them felt a chill in their hearts. Even this level of cultivator is afraid of this powerful person. This was the shocking thought in the hearts of many cultivators. With this thought in mind, each and every one of them became serious, and their gazes towards Luo Fan became even more vigilant. Although you don't have the ability to restrain me, you have restrained my body, the middle-aged wandering cultivator said with an ugly expression. His voice sounded like it came from the deepest hell, and it contained a deep and unparalleled killing intent. Almost all the cultivators who heard his voice felt a real chill envelop their bodies, and some of them even heard the sound of ice cracking in just the time it took for one sentence. The originally normal climate of the ruins of the world group had turned into an ice age. All the cultivators were even more shocked at this moment. Originally, many cultivators might have suspected that the middle-aged wandering cultivator was only strong on the outside and was actually not that powerful. However, now that the middle-aged wandering cultivator had displayed this move, they no longer dared to have any doubts. Just the ability to affect everyone's body and mind with just his voice alone meant that it would only take the middle-aged cultivator some effort to deal with them. The strength of such an existence was clearly enough to match the aura he displayed. Luo Fan smiled faintly and said, "It's not me that's restraining your body, it's the fourth layer itself." His words and the middle-aged wandering cultivator's words were completely unrelated, causing the other cultivators to feel confused. They could not understand what the two of them were talking about. In fact, what the middle-aged unaffiliated cultivator wanted to express was very simple. Although he had regained his sense of self, his memories, his strength, and everything else, he had regained control over himself. However, on a deeper level, their essence had already undergone some subtle changes. Now, they had almost become a part of a larger, more mysterious existence. Their independence had been unknowingly challenged, and to a certain extent, they had already lost it. In fact, they were no different from those rogue cultivators whose cosmos clusters had merged with other cosmos clusters. The only difference between them was that they behaved differently. It was precisely because of this that the middle-aged rogue cultivator said that Luo Fan had already imprisoned his body. As for what Luo Fan said, it was even simpler. In fact, the real reason for this was not the result of his power, nor was it the result of his divine ability or power. At the bottom of it all, the reason why everything had developed to this stage was because of the evolution of the fourth layer of the Tao Sovereign's path. Whether it was the merging of many worlds or the fact that the middle-aged wandering cultivator felt that his body was being restrained, everything was the result of the evolution of the fourth layer of the Tao Sovereign's path. This seemed inconceivable, but in fact it was a very simple logic. The characteristic of the fourth layer of the Tao Sovereign's path was that it existed in the cultivator's river of time. From the beginning, when he could create worlds, and spacetime, all the worlds, and spacetime that he had created gathered together to form a group of worlds. Under such circumstances, as the cultivator's river of time continued to develop, the worlds, and spacetime that he created would naturally grow. For ordinary cultivators, this was nothing. As long as they did not make a move, everything would be in an absolutely stable state. Even if they made a move, they would at most increase the number of worlds, and spacetime in their own group of worlds to strengthen it. However, it was obvious that Luo Fan was not an ordinary cultivator. Over the past tens of millions of years, everything he had done had far exceeded the imagination of all the cultivators on the fourth layer of the Tao Sovereign's path. He had even surpassed everything that had been achieved by those who had experienced the fourth layer of the Tao Sovereign's path since ancient times. He had forcibly taken control of all the independent cultivators, disciples of Tao Sovereigns, and even experts from higher levels. He had incorporated the wills of all the cultivators who had come to the fourth layer into his own group of worlds, and brought their group of worlds into his control. Under such circumstances, as time passed, the countless worlds, and spacetime created by the countless cultivators, and even the actions of the countless cultivators in the various worlds, and spacetime naturally became part of his history, and naturally became a part of his river of time. In this way, with the special characteristics of the fourth level of the Tao Master's Road, with the help of the endless power of creation, Luo Fan's world group would naturally grow correspondingly, giving rise to all kinds of subtle changes. In the end, all the cultivators' world group, and even all the cultivators themselves, would gradually be included. In other words, Luo Fan's group of worlds had unknowingly grown countless times during this period of time, and it had naturally given birth to countless worlds, and spacetimes that corresponded to the cultivators' group of world. It was even to the extent that as these worlds, and spacetimes were born, corresponding cultivators were born. The emergence of such changes should have been independent and had nothing to do with the other cultivators themselves. However, those cultivators were cultivators who had integrated into Luo Fan's group of worlds, and those groups of worlds were also worlds that were connected to Luo Fan's group of world. In this way, with all kinds of subtle and wonderful encounters, the worlds, and spacetime that corresponded to the various groups of worlds, and the cultivators that corresponded to the various groups of worlds naturally merged with the independent cultivators and their groups of worlds. And the result of such a fusion was what many of the independent cultivators had sensed at this moment. Their own groups of worlds had unknowingly become part of a larger group of worlds. In fact, it was not just the independent cultivators. The worlds of other cultivators, including the worlds of the Tao Masters, had also begun to merge. However, because they had just regained their sense of self and had just reconnected with their own groups of worlds, the process was still in the initial stage, so the results were not fully revealed. This was also the fundamental reason why some of the independent cultivators' groups of worlds were destroyed, while the independent cultivators themselves were unharmed, because their own foundation had changed, and they had become a larger group of worlds that were billions of times larger. The connection between them and their own groups of worlds was no longer as tight. Of course, this was also the reason why Luo Fan's world group seemed to have been completely destroyed, but he was still unharmed. It did not affect any of his memories or cultivation achievements. In fact, his world group had expanded tens of thousands of times. The damage to the original part of the world group was no different from the damage to a part of a world or a piece of spacetime in a complete world group. Under such circumstances, he naturally would not be affected by it. The middle-aged independent cultivator did not fully understand all of this, even if he was going to die. But he had already understood that everything that had happened was actually within the opponent's calculations. It was the result that the opponent had deliberately created. When he understood this, he felt an inexplicable fear in his heart. What the hell do you want to do? Doing this won't do you any good for your ascension. On the contrary, it will greatly slow down your ascension. Why are you doing this? The middle-aged independent cultivator said with an inexplicable expression. As someone who had ascended, he had the most right to speak about how to ascend to the fifth level of the Tao Master's path. Therefore, he was the only one who could convince them with his word. Ascension? I'm not pursuing ascension. Luo Fan only smiled and said so. The orthodox method of ascension at the fourth level of the Tao Master's path was to control one's own world cluster through cultivation, carry out the power of one's own world cluster, and finally integrate this power into the whole world cluster, so that the whole world cluster would be completely integrated into the power of the world cluster, and then this power would be integrated into the cultivator's body, truly integrated into one, and no distinction would be made between them. In other words, it was similar to a process of completely assimilating one's own world group. According to this standard, the smaller the world group, although the power of the world group would be smaller, it would also be less difficult to assimilate the world group, and naturally, the difficulty of ascension would also be lower. Moreover, the wider the world cluster, the greater the power of the world cluster, but the more difficult it would be to assimilate it into the power and then assimilate it into one's body. For cultivators, their wisdom should be placed on how to grasp the balance between the two, and what kind of foundation they should use to ascend. This was a choice for cultivators. Obviously, no matter how one looked at it, Luo Fan's unscrupulous method of strengthening his own world group, and unscrupulously deepening his connection with other world groups, was obviously not a wise choice. This was what made the middle-aged independent cultivator feel incredulous. After all, in his understanding, wasn't the ultimate goal of the Tao Master's path to the end, and then past the Tao Master's path? For this purpose, ascension was naturally the biggest goal of their cultivation. As long as it hindered his ascension, he should just abandon it. Using this standard, Luo Fan's method was really unimaginably stupid, and compared to his own ability, it was simply the opposite of the extreme. This was also a difference in concept. For Luo Fan, the number of levels of the Tao Master's path was actually not that important. What was important was the improvement of his own cultivation, and the growth of his worldview. If he could improve his cultivation realm to the true sage realm in the first level, and if he could improve his worldview to the true sage level, he would definitely not enter the second level. Under such a guiding ideology, what was ascension in his eyes? Regardless of whether it was good or bad for ascension to be improved in the fourth level, he would definitely not let it go. Because of this, he would do what the middle-aged independent cultivator thought was extremely stupid at this time. Hearing Luo Fan's words, the middle-aged independent cultivator's face was full of astonishment. Not ascension? Why did you enter the Tao Master's path? You actually gave up ascension for the sake of a little power. You're simply neglecting the essentials, he said in disbelief. As he said this, there was actually a hint of anger in his eyes. However, Luo Fan secretly shook his head. I'm neglecting the essentials? You're the ones neglecting the essentials, aren't you? What is the purpose of the Tao Master's path? If one really only needed to reach the end to become a true sage, then how could there only be thousands of true sages in the great Tao Master universe? From ancient times to the present, and even in the infinite future, the number of cultivators who were able to reach the 9th level, even with the smallest probability, must be counted in the hundreds of thousands. However, up until now, how many true sages, also known as Tao Masters, were there in the great Tao Master universe? The purpose of the Tao Master's path is only to guide cultivators, to let them know the direction of cultivation. What's important is not how many levels you reach, but how much nutrients you absorb from each level to achieve your own success. If you don't get enough nutrients, even if you use the fastest speed to reach the 9th level, you'll only be a cultivator at the 9th level, and you won't be able to become a true sage. However, there was naturally no need for him to say these words to the middle-aged independent cultivator. After all, he and the middle-aged cultivator were enemies. Chapter 2264. Luo Fan merely looked at the middle-aged itinerant cultivator's incredulity. He did not retort, nor did he fly into a rage out of humiliation. His performance made the middle-aged cultivator's expression of anger become even more obvious. In fact, his gaze had already turned into one that looked at Xiao Mu like he was a piece of rotten wood. He looked like a senior who had already succeeded watching a junior walk on a dead end, but he didn't realize it and stubbornly refused to mend his ways. Luo Fan merely smiled faintly. With a thought, the power of the world group surged, and the power of creation frantically seeped into the world group. The endless ruins in the world group seemed to be flowing in reverse, and they began to reform at an unimaginable speed. Heaven and earth, worlds, and space-time began to rapidly reform in the eyes of the cultivators. Everything looked like a giant hand was grabbing the axis of time and starting to reverse it. Even the cultivators who had already guessed this could not help but be dumbfounded. They could not believe what they were seeing. He can actually recover so easily. That was the thought that appeared in the hearts of the cultivators, filled with endless despair. An extremely deep sense of despair dominated the hearts of the cultivators, causing them to float in the void between the endless heaven and earth, worlds, and space-time in a daze. Their expressions were blank and numb. Even the middle-aged itinerant cultivator's eyes were filled with shock. "What exactly is your goal?" he mumbled as he looked at Luo Fan, who looked like an ordinary person at first glance, but was like a giant when he sensed it carefully. His heart was filled with doubt and confusion. He could not understand what Luo Fan's actions were. All of his actions seemed to follow the guidance of a certain pattern and seemed to have a hidden goal. However, he could not figure out what it was, and he did not understand what Luo Fan was trying to achieve in the end. If one only looked at his actions, they would even feel that all of his actions were so chaotic, like a headless fly. Just what is it? Frowning, the middle-aged loose cultivator became even more confused. Luo Fan naturally didn't pay attention to the doubts and shock of the many cultivators. At this time, he just manipulated the power of creation, manipulated the power of the world cluster, and constantly grabbed the destroyed heaven and earth, worlds, and space-time from his own river of time, so that the world cluster that had already turned into ruins quickly recovered and became whole again. In just a few short breaths, all these changes had completely stopped. At this moment, the ruins had turned back into an intact world cluster. It looked exactly the same as before they had entered the world cluster, and it had not been damaged at all. In fact, even the countless living beings and cultivators that existed within it were the same. There was not the slightest change. "How about I let you guys destroy this place again?" After doing all that, Luo Fan turned to face the cultivators and said with a faint smile. Hearing this, the expressions of the cultivators changed drastically. Luo Fan's behavior was like a slap to their faces. Destroying the entire world cluster? Didn't this mean that even if they used all their means, they would not be able to really threaten him? However, although they were extremely unwilling and displeased, the situation was beyond their control. They, indeed, did not have the ability to cause real damage to Luo Fan's world group. Even if Luo Fan really placed the world group in front of them without any defense, they could only repeat the process of turning the world group into ruins. There was no way they could cause any more damage. For Luo Fan, this kind of action of turning the world group into ruins could be completely restored with a single thought. Under such circumstances, what confidence did they have to refute Luo Fan's disdain? For a moment, the cultivators fell into silence. Looking at the many cultivators, Luo Fan's consciousness rose and gradually came into contact with an invisible existence that filled the entire fourth level of the Tao Master's path. This invisible existence seemed illusory yet real. It could even be said that the degree of illusory was countless times more than the degree of reality. If one were to take it seriously, perhaps only one out of billions of illusory existences would correspond to the real one. This existence covered the entire fourth level of the Tao Master's path. It seemed to have combined with the endless power of creation, but it was also above the infinite power of creation. It looked like the reflection of the fourth level on an unimaginable existence. Although it covered the entire fourth level of the Tao Master's path, it did not mean that this invisible existence itself was completely uniform. In fact, this invisible existence had a core and focus. In the core, where the key was located, the density of the invisible existence was many times denser than in other areas. And the core, the focus, was none other than the billions of cultivators in front of Luo Fan at this moment. The thoughts in the hearts of countless cultivators affected the operation and distribution of this invisible existence. At this moment, in Luo Fan's eyes, the invisible existence lingered around the many cultivators, surging wildly according to the changes of these cultivators' emotions. Strange long rivers constantly gushed out of their bodies, bypassing complicated or simple trajectories around them, and then turning back to their bodies from another direction. During this process, it was as if some sort of existence was being brought out of his body and fused with the countless invisible existences around him, causing the invisible existences to undergo all sorts of subtle changes during this process, causing the invisible existences to undergo these changes at every moment. At this time, Luo Fan occupied an absolutely dominant position in this invisible existence. Even though he was just a projection, he was already able to control almost every inch of the entire invisible existence, and control the connection between this invisible existence and every cultivator. It seemed that if he wanted to, it was even possible to expel a cultivator from this invisible existence. This invisible existence was actually the general trend of the entire fourth level of the Tao Master's path. It was a special existence that existed between illusion and reality. It could even be said that it was more of an illusion than reality. In other words, it was a kind of existence that could only be sensed by living beings who were aware of its existence. It was just like the origin of the laws. At this moment, the reason why Luo Fan could have such a strong control over this general trend was because he had control over all the cultivators on the fourth level of the Tao Master's path in his hands. To be more specific, it was because he could decide the life and death of all the cultivators on the fourth level of the Tao Master's path, so he had become the true ruler of the entire fourth level of the Tao Master's path. Therefore, he could naturally control the general trend of the fourth level. If he wanted to, he could even use this general trend that was under his control to increase his cultivation speed. It was just like what the fourth level rogue cultivator, who had become a ruler on the third level of the Tao Master's path, had done. However, it was obvious that he was unwilling to do so. Although there were many benefits to this kind of support, he did not care about it. At least, compared to the effort he had spent to control the lives of countless cultivators, this kind of gain was not worth the loss. The general trend sounded mysterious, but it was actually a special existence that was abstracted from the influence that all the living beings on the fourth level of the Tao Master's path had on the fourth level of the Tao Master's path. This kind of existence, if used well, could mobilize most of the power of the entire fourth level of the Tao Master's path. Just using it to increase one's cultivation speed was like using a cannon to kill a mosquito. It was a great waste. It's almost done. At this moment, Luo Fan carefully sensed the general trend that filled the entire fourth level of the Tao Master's path, and this thought flashed through his mind. Since the general trend was abstracted from the influence that all living beings had on the fourth level, it was naturally closely related to the thoughts of all living beings. Normally, after Luo Fan controlled the life and death of all living beings and became the ruler of all living beings, which meant that he was the true ruler of the entire fourth level of the Tao Master's path, he could already control the general trend that filled the entire fourth level of the Tao Master's path. However, such control was actually only the most basic control. It was like a king unifying a country. If all the people in the country did not agree with the king's rule and even thought that they could easily overthrow the king as long as they rose up in revolt, then the king's rule must be superficial. Even if the king wanted to erect a statue for himself, he would encounter many obstacles and have to pay a great price to succeed. And Luo Fan's rule over the fourth level of the Tao Master's path was like the king's rule over his unified country. Originally, many cultivators did not clearly understand how big the gap between them and him was. There were even many disciples of the Tao masters who thought that they had only fallen into his control because of a moment of carelessness. If they were serious and recovered their strength, they would be able to easily get rid of him. Under such circumstances, how much could the general trend, which was dominated by them and influenced by their mentality, obey Luo Fan? Perhaps this kind of submission was enough for the cultivators who wanted to obtain cultivation support from the general trend, and it was enough to make them satisfied. However, for Luo Fan, who now had more ideas about the general trend and wanted to guide it to achieve other things, it was clearly far from enough. It was precisely because of this that Luo Fan had taken the previous action to let countless cultivators truly recover, and then directly display his strength in front of them. No matter what methods they used, he would completely display the gap between them, so as to truly dispel the unrealistic fantasies in the hearts of many cultivators, and make them truly submit from the bottom of their hearts. Only in this way could the general trend that was influenced by their mentality and emotions truly submit to Luo Fan. Clearly, at this moment in Luo Fan's senses, the abstract and invisible existence's submission to him had already reached a certain limit, and it was barely enough for him to achieve his goal. As that thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind, many cultivators felt an indescribable discomfort from the bottom of their hearts. This discomfort was so strange and so absolute. After it appeared, it made them all extremely annoyed. Numerous gazes looked around, searching for the source of this discomfort. In the end, their gazes landed on Luo Fan, who was currently floating in the center of the world group. At this moment, Luo Fan did not seem any different from before at first glance, but if one took a closer look, they would discover that there was an absolute dignity on him. It was as if he had become the most dignified and absolute existence in their hearts. Every wisp of aura and every trace of his aura seemed to have penetrated the deepest part of their hearts, hitting the most vulnerable part at the bottom of their hearts. An emotion of respect that had never appeared before involuntarily emerged in their hearts. Their original fear, anger, and hatred towards Luo Fan had unknowingly transformed into a kind of reverence. As soon as this emotion appeared, many cultivators felt that something was wrong, and at the same time, they felt a kind of anger from the distortion of their selves. As experts who could reach the fourth level of the Tao Master's path, how could they not know where their emotions came from? How could they not feel if their perception was distorted? However, even if they were angry, it was difficult for them to really direct their anger at Luo Fan. After all, the distortion of their emotions and their selves was not just for show. It was a kind of distortion that was produced from the root. Even if they recognized and knew of this distortion, before they could twist it back, they could not do anything about it. As for twisting this distortion back, it was naturally impossible for them now. After all, this distortion came from the general trend that they had abstracted. It could be said that unless they cut off their connection with the general trend, or completely defeated Luo Fan, who was floating in front of them at this time, there was no way they could change this situation. This kind of anger naturally could not last long, and soon it dissipated. As for those cultivators, after their anger dissipated, they were quickly filled with intense anger once again. In fact, their anger was even stronger than before. Some of it was directed at Luo Fan, but most of it was directed at themselves. They were angry that they did not even have the ability to be angry at Luo Fan. It seems that you should already know my purpose. At this time, Luo Fan looked at the many cultivators, a faint smile on his face, and said so. Chapter 2265. Why would I wait until now if I wanted to help my cultivation? Luo Fan said with a faint smile. Please search for //ia/u// As he spoke, his heart stirred slightly, and the great momentum began to flow strangely under his control. In this strange flow, there was a very subtle power that began to gather between his hands. Gradually, an indescribable light began to leak out from between his hands. This light was mysterious and wonderful. In the process of gathering, it was like rivers flowing into the sea. Countless small streams of light, like rivers, constantly gathered between his hands. As this stream of light gathered, all the cultivators faintly felt an inexplicable shock from the bottom of their hearts. From the stream of light, from the ball of light that was formed by the stream of light, they clearly felt that it contained an absolute power that was completely aimed at all of them. A feeling that they could not resist any order or power produced by this light shook all of their minds at this time. What is this? This was the thought that came to the minds of all the cultivators. He has materialized this kind of rule? The middle-aged individual cultivator from the fifth layer was more knowledgeable, and he instantly knew the nature of the light that had condensed in Luo Fan's hands. However, even if he understood, he was even more surprised and could not understand. After all, this kind of absolute rule over the entire fourth layer of the Tao Master's path would not be beneficial to him at all. On the contrary, it would make him have to go through an additional procedure when ruling the fourth layer, which would greatly reduce his efficiency. No matter from which perspective, it was obviously not a wise choice. We must destroy this. Otherwise, we will never be able to reincarnate. Although the cultivators did not know the nature of the light, they knew that once it appeared, they would fall into an extremely bad situation. For a moment, the crowd was in a turbulent mood, and each of them had a strong desire to kill. However, this desire to kill, like the anger from before, could not be locked on to Luo Fan. It could only be used on the light in Luo Fan's hands. Moreover, even if they targeted the light, they could not maintain it for long. They needed to strengthen their desire to kill from time to time. Obviously, this light, for them, had a trace of Luo Fan's characteristics. Immediately, a Tao Master's disciple gathered enough desire to kill and took action. A ray of light burst out from the crowd of cultivators, directly wrapped in earth-shattering power, and directly blasted towards the constantly growing and condensing light in Luo Fan's hands. This blast contained not only the pure impact force, but also hundreds of millions of mysterious and strange attacks. It produced hundreds of millions of changes in the void, giving rise to countless strange worlds and spacetimes, and directly fell towards the light in Luo Fan's hands. In the places where it passed through, there were hundreds of millions of changes in the void. It was twisted into pieces, corroded, and distorted. These were only the most basic changes. Apart from that, there were countless strange things that were born in those areas, as well as billions of strange hybrids that were created. Just like that, the commotion produced was so strong that it shook the endless spacetime, and even the entire world group was filled with the terrifying commotion. His action was like a switch, activating the other cultivators' attacks. For a time, it was unknown how many hundreds of millions of attacks were launched from various cultivators. In the same complex and mysterious way, they quickly rushed towards the ball of light in Luo Fan's hands from all directions. In the blink of an eye, they had already arrived between his hands and frantically converged towards the ball of light between his hands. However, the middle-aged unaffiliated cultivator from the fifth level was not among the cultivators that attacked. At this moment, when he saw the cultivators attacking the light in Luo Fan's hands, he could only shake his head inwardly and mumble to himself, "What's the point of these attacks? This is the essence of the power that all of you have abstracted. Even if it's not completely formed, it's still not something you can resist. Not only will your attacks not cause any damage to it, but they will also provide it with more power." While the middle-aged, unaffiliated cultivator was thinking that, the countless attacks had already gathered on the light. However, the ball of light completely ignored the countless attacks, allowing them to bombard its interior. Furthermore, it did not suffer any damage from the attack. The entire ball of light looked like a boundless black hole that devoured all the attacks. Not long after, when the attacks stopped, the light was already several times more dazzling than before. At the sight of this, all the cultivators were stunned, and they didn't dare to believe what they were seeing. At this moment, Luo Fan had already finished the last part of his work. His heart moved slightly, and he let out a soft cry. As he let out a soft cry, the light in his hand had already condensed into a seal. It was a gray, ordinary, rectangular seal without any words or special decorations. After the seal appeared, the core of the general trend that filled the fourth level of the Tao Master's path had completely shifted from Luo Fan to the seal. Moreover, because the seal itself was not a living creature, nor was it made of flesh and blood, after it became the core of the general trend, its performance was completely different from when Luo Fan was the core of the general trend. In contrast, its degree of integration with the general trend was much higher. Faintly, it was as if it was the core formed by the convergence of the general trend. Even the slight fluctuations that came from it had an impact on the general trend that was at least 10 times greater than the fluctuations that came from Luo Fan's body. At this moment, the cultivators' killing intent towards the seal had already been greatly reduced in their hearts. Originally, they could at least maintain it for a few breaths of time, which was enough for them to attack without needing to strengthen their killing intent. But now, the murderous intent they had towards the seal could not even remain in their hearts for a moment. As long as it was born, it would naturally dissipate under some mysterious power. It even made them feel guilty, as if they had let something down by giving birth to this killing intent. However, they clearly knew that this change was not normal at all. There was some kind of external force that was affecting their mentality, affecting all their actions. This sort of conflict caused all of them to become indescribably agitated, and their every move seemed rather helpless. Suddenly, a cultivator looked at Luo Fan and murmured, "It seems like I've already lost that feeling towards him." His words instantly reminded all the cultivators, causing them to involuntarily shift their gazes from the seal to Luo Fan. In an instant, all the cultivators found that their anger towards Luo Fan seemed to be able to be maintained. The mysterious power that had previously erased their anger seemed to have completely disappeared. Is it a transfer? Thinking of their feelings towards the seal, these cultivators all had this guess. Following this guess, countless thoughts instantly appeared in their mind. If I take the seal, will I be able to replace his position and become an existence that no one dares to attack, or even attack with their thoughts? This thought flashed through almost all the cultivators' minds. Being able to cultivate to this level, how could one not be ambitious enough? If such an existence found out that he could control everyone else's treasure and take it away, he would definitely not reveal it to the public and not use it. Instead, he would completely control it. He would obtain the ownership of the treasure and become the owner of the treasure. For a moment, almost all the cultivators' breathing became much heavier. Seeing this, Luo Fan only smiled in his heart. Without any hesitation, he tossed the seal toward the crowd of cultivators. In an instant, the seal turned into a ray of light and directly fell among the cultivators, hovering there quietly. The cultivators were slightly stunned. Clearly, they did not understand why Luo Fan did this. They did not understand why he would discard the treasure without a care after obtaining it. However, although they did not understand the reason behind it, it was not enough to stop them from taking action. At this instant, the cultivators closest to the seal directly pounced at the seal and began to attack each other frantically along the way. They wanted to defeat the other party and take the seal for themselves. When these cultivators attacked Luo Fan and the ball of light before the seal was formed, although their methods were ingenious and powerful, the difference in strength was too great. The targets they attacked were easily dealt with by their methods, so they did not reveal too much of a commotion. This made their attacks seem ordinary, as if there was nothing too special about them. However, that was only because the gap between them was too great. In fact, when these cultivators attacked each other, the momentum produced by their attacks was so great that it was unimaginable. Billions of worlds were born and billions of worlds were destroyed at every turn. As for the number of living beings they created and the number of living beings they destroyed, it was a number that could not be described with numbers. For a moment, countless powerful and terrifying auras erupted from where the seal was. In the blink of an eye, the surroundings were in a state of chaos due to the obstruction of each other. No cultivator could immediately take the seal for themselves. As they paused for a moment, the other cultivators also reacted. One by one, cultivators pounced onto the battlefield from all directions and joined the chaotic battle. That battlefield, that chaos, naturally became more and more powerful and more terrifying. What's the point of doing this? The middle-aged rogue cultivator from the 5th floor did not look at the battlefield. Instead, he fixed his gaze on Luo Fan, who was floating in the distance. In his eyes, Luo Fan's actions were extremely strange. He could not see any point in doing this at all. Do you just want to see them fight among themselves? Do you want to see them fight over the seal? In the end, this was only a guess that appeared in his mind. As for the seal, he did not have much desire to take it. After all, the seal came from Luo Fan. Since that was the case, as long as Luo Fan was willing, he could naturally take it back. Under such circumstances, no matter how precious the seal was, there was no point in taking it. Of course, he did not look down on the cultivators who were fighting over the seal. This was because he knew the fundamental reason why the cultivators were fighting over the seal. How could the cultivators not know that even if they obtained the seal, it would be for naught? What would happen in the end would depend on the thoughts of the powerhouses. However, to them, this was already their last hope. This was their last hope to obtain freedom and escape from the shackles, suppression, and restrictions of Luo Fan. The amount of power they could obtain from controlling the seal was secondary. Most importantly, after obtaining the seal, they would have a greater say in front of Luo Fan. At the very least, their status would be much higher than before. This would definitely be more beneficial to their pursuit of transcendence and freedom. Luo Fan watched as the battlefield grew larger and larger. In the end, it even affected his entire group of worlds, causing his entire group of worlds to shake from the battle of the cultivators. It was as if it could not withstand the impact of the power and was about to disintegrate. He couldn't help but smile. With a wave of his hand, light and shadow fluctuated. They had already arrived outside his group of worlds, inside the vortex. Among the many rapidly fusing worlds, there was an extremely spacious place, that's right. Now, the worlds under the Tao Masters and the rogue cultivators under his control, which had not yet been mixed together, were being mixed together. If this had happened in the past, this would have been a despairing reality for the cultivators. It would have been enough to make them hysterical. However, at this moment, the rogue cultivators and the Tao Masters had already suffered a huge blow. They had already treated this matter as normal, and not many of them even paid attention to it. Chapter 2266. To them, their fight was a struggle for their own hopes of freedom, a struggle for the possibility of transcending. However, to Luo Fan, their fight had another effect. It was an effect that he needed right now. Fighting represented the hostility between each other, and it also represented the conflict between the various existences. Meanwhile, this was reflected in the general trend that was abstractly formed from the abilities, might, and everything else. It was the general trend that lost its stability. From its originally calm and gentle state, it became turbulent, surging up and down. It was difficult for even a single one of them to remain stable. For existences who wanted to rely on the general trend to increase their cultivation speed, they naturally had to avoid this at all costs. It was just like how the turbulent waves on the sea were a disaster for fishermen who wanted to sail on the sea. However, to Luo Fan, the situation was obviously completely different. One must know that Luo Fan's idea of the general trend was not just to get a little boost in cultivation speed. What he wanted was the greater potential of the general trend. It was just like how he did not care about the convenience of sailing on the sea to cross continents in the boundless sea. What he wanted was the power contained in the boundless sea, the endless resources at the bottom of the sea, and the endless creatures that were born from it. Under such circumstances, the surface of the sea became turbulent, which was obviously a great thing for him. Only when he moved would he have greater power. To use the most superficial analogy to describe it, for example, the general trend could be compared to the sea. In that case, if he wanted to use the sea to generate electricity and borrow the tides to generate electricity, it would naturally be better if the sea rose and fell, and the more turbulent the sea was, the better it would be. At this moment, Luo Fan's use of the general trend was similar to this. Facing the boundless, turbulent, and unstable general trend, he smiled faintly. With a thought, strands of power started to be drawn out from the general trend. They continuously crossed space-time and entered the light of heaven and earth outside the vortex. The power drawn out from the general trend seemed both real and fake. Its essence seemed to be extremely low, as if it did not exist. It also seemed to be extremely high, as if it was above the state of chaos. In the process of the endless power entering the light of heaven and earth, the light of heaven and earth endured an indescribably terrifying pressure. The pressure from the emotional space-time that had gradually calmed down suddenly began to surge and become chaotic. All sorts of powers, objects, and powers that did not exist before began to evolve and change wildly, trying their best to collapse or expel this power. It was a pity that the nature of this power was so strange when it was not moving. It seemed to be difficult to grasp, fluctuating between high and low. However, when it encountered an opponent and clashed with the power of the light of heaven and earth, it was like a dragon that had been awakened from its slumber. It began to surge wildly, and its power increased crazily. In the blink of an eye, it had already expanded by hundreds of millions of times. When it clashed with the power of the light of heaven and earth, the resulting conflict turned into a boundless impact that almost completely tore the light of heaven and earth apart. At this moment, the emotional space-time that could still support itself let out a silent wail. Strange creaking sounds continuously came from within. Then, the entire emotional space-time collapsed in an instant. Everything that made up the emotional space-time, whether it was the fragments of the space-time, the fragments of the power within it, or the fragments of the countless creatures that had been derived from it, everything collapsed in an instant and turned into countless tiny fragments. In the aftermath of the battle between the light of heaven and earth and the power drawn out from the general trend, they completely disappeared without a trace, as if they had never existed. Just the aftermath of the impact with the light of heaven and earth had already completely collapsed the emotional space-time. One could imagine how powerful the power drawn out from the general trend was. If such power was used to attack a cultivator, even the middle-aged rogue cultivator from the fifth layer would not be able to withstand it for more than a few breaths. It was even possible that the waxen middle-aged man, who was a disciple of a higher Tao master, might not be able to withstand the suppression of the power drawn out from the general trend. In the vortex, the fight between the many cultivators had not subsided, and naturally, the ups and downs of the general trend had not subsided. With the surging and undulating, the power drawn out from the general trend by Luo Fan seemed to have obtained an unquenchable source. At every moment, there was infinite power being generated. Then, according to Luo Fan's will, it was drawn out to supplement the light of heaven and earth, and the power that was continuously consumed because of the battle with the light of heaven and earth. This change was a good thing for the power fighting against the light of heaven and earth, because this meant that he would be able to receive an endless supply of energy, and he would be able to constantly fight against the strongest opponents he had ever encountered. For the general trend, or in other words, for the entire fourth layer of the road to Tao Master, this was not a bad thing. Because the power produced by the ups and downs of the general trend was actually the potential stimulated by the chaos of the general trend. If it was not extracted, this power would continue to stir up the general trend, causing the chaos in the general trend to continue to intensify and accumulate. In the end, when this power accumulated to a certain extent, to the extent that the general trend could not suppress or restrict it, the general trend would naturally collapse and be completely destroyed. At that time, the entire fourth layer of the road to Tao Master would fall into absolute chaos. All sorts of unimaginable disasters would descend on the fourth floor at the same time. They would descend on all the cultivators on the fourth floor until all the cultivators and living beings on the path to becoming a Tao sovereign were completely wiped out before everything would calm down. This was also a tribulation, in fact, in all the heavens and earth, all the worlds, all the spacetimes. Most of the tribulations were born because of this principle. However, there weren't existences like Luo Fan in those heavens and the earth, worlds, and spacetime to abstract out the general situation, so everything seemed so illusory, causing the descent of the tribulation to seem to be traceless. But now, with Luo Fan constantly extracting that power and consuming it, the chaos of the general trend would not completely disappear, but it would not continue to increase with the passage of time. Naturally, it would not be so strong that the general trend could not suppress it, to the extent that the general trend would completely collapse and lead to the arrival of the tribulation. The efficiency is still too low. Although the pressure that the light of heaven and earth withstood was much stronger than when it faced the emotional spacetime, it still did not reach the level where it could force the light of heaven and earth to transform. He could not help but feel a little dissatisfied, and the efficiency he was referring to was the efficiency of extracting the power from the general trend. Of course, there were differences in the efficiency of extracting power. It was like using the tide to generate electricity. Different generator structures and different generators could obviously obtain different amounts of electricity. Among them, some were more and some were less, which naturally represented the efficiency of using the tide. Similarly, the potential that Luo Fan could trigger from the chaos in the general trend would naturally differ according to the method he used. This was also the efficiency of using the power. At this moment, although Luo Fan had already extracted close to 80% of the power and injected it into the light of heaven and earth, it was only 80%. The remaining 20% was still hidden in the depths of the general trend, still turning into a driving force that stirred the general trend into chaos, causing the general trend to surge and change continuously in the process. And if this portion of power could be used, it would definitely make the power extracted from the general trend sublimate in essence. Although the remaining 20% of power did not seem like much, it was only close to 20%. In fact, this 20% of power was a shortcoming and a gap in the power extracted from the general trend. And if this shortcoming and gap were filled, the power that could be exerted would naturally far exceed the ordinary stacking of these powers. Sublimation and transformation were almost inevitable. Various thoughts flashed through Luo Fan's mind, and wisps of strange brilliance flashed through his eyes. Countless ideas and endless information kept appearing in his mind, bit by bit, constantly gathering into various mysterious and wonderful thoughts. In turn, they turned into various wonderful divine abilities and powers that gradually took shape in his mind. In the end, these countless divine abilities and powers evolved according to his worldview and converged into an indescribably mysterious divine ability. The appearance of this divine ability instantly caused Luo Fan's body to emit a faintly discernible aura that absolutely targeted the general trend. Under this aura, the general trend that covered the entire fourth level of the Tao Master's path actually began to circle around him, causing the area around him to gradually become a vacuum of the general trend. This caused a small hole to appear in the general trend that covered the fourth level of the Tao Master's path. It seems that this divine ability should be very effective. Sensing this scene, this thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind, and an inexplicable smile appeared on his face. At this moment, he couldn't wait to see how efficient it was to use this god art to plunder the power that was born in the general trend. Previously, he did not use any divine ability, and only relied purely on his own thoughts and perception to guide 80% of the power. Now that he had directly created a divine ability that completely targeted the general trend, the efficiency had increased by hundreds or thousands of times. It would not be an exaggeration to guide and extract 100% of the power, right? With this thought, an inexplicable light began to gradually radiate from his body. This light was so strange, yet so mysterious. At first glance, it seemed to be just an ordinary white light, but upon closer inspection, one would find that this light did not seem to exist, as if the white light just now was just an illusion. But when one looked away, they would find that it was white light again from the corner of their eyes. In this way, it seemed to be real, and illusory. It was extremely mysterious. After this light was born, the surrounding general trend that was originally about to avoid him began to tremble slightly, like an extremely timid creature that was afraid of its natural enemy. However, even so, they did not dare to directly leave where Luo Fan was. Instead, they trembled and constantly approached him, finally slowly filling up the hole that had previously been formed by the aura that Luo Fan emitted against the general trend. At this moment, Luo Fan raised his hand and pointed in the air. From his body, the seemingly real, and illusory, but mysterious light had already been extracted. Like a thread, it directly drilled into the nothingness, deep into the general trend, and disappeared from the eyes of all the creatures that could not see the general trend. At this moment, if someone was able to see the general trend, they would see that after these threads entered the general trend, they began to split up at an unimaginable speed and in a crazy manner. From 1 to a trillion, each trillion turned into another trillion, and then another trillion. In the blink of an eye, it had turned into an incomparably huge and dense network that filled the entire fourth level of the Tao Sovereign Path. It completely covered all the general trend of the fourth level of the Tao Sovereign Path. Or rather, cloth with the cover of this cloth, the originally incomparably chaotic, constantly surging general trend seemed to be forcibly suppressed by an invisible hand. All the chaos, all the surging, all the chaos completely calmed down in an instant. At this moment, in front of Luo Fan, the power that came from the general trend that had been injected into the mass of light of heaven and earth in front of him began to expand madly. It was as if the power that had been injected into it had suddenly increased by an unknown number of times. Moreover, in the midst of this expansion, this power suddenly erupted with an unimaginable might. It was an absolute, irresistible aura that surpassed the state of primal chaos. Even Luo Fan's hair stood on end when he sensed it. It was somewhat unbearable. A kind of perfection, a feeling of perfection, seeped out from this power that had never been seen before. With this change, Luo Fan's light of heaven and earth collapsed in an instant. In the blink of an eye, the state that had originally enveloped the power had been reversed. In the blink of an eye, it had been directly divided into an unknown number of trillions of parts by the power. In turn, each part was directly enveloped by the power. It's done. In the face of this incomparably tragic change, Luo Fan instead breathed a sigh of relief, and an inexplicable smile appeared on his face. Puff, with a soft sound, his body completely collapsed under the impact of the power, and not even a trace of it was left. In the blink of an eye, it was as if he no longer existed in the fourth level of the Tao Master's road. It was clear that the impact from the instantaneous completion of this power completely disregarded his existence and directly wiped him off the face of the earth. Chapter 2267. This kind of power that was extracted from the general trend itself faintly had the characteristics of targeting other planes. If it were to completely target Luo Fan, then the layers of barriers that appeared around his body at this time would certainly not have much effect. However, it was clear that the power that was extracted from the general trend was not completely targeted at Luo Fan. Instead, it was targeted at the light of heaven and earth that had already been separated. Under such circumstances, the power that was targeted at Luo Fan was naturally just the aftermath. In this way, the pressure that was produced on him became insignificant. It was not even enough to shake the barrier. At this moment, Luo Fan, who had recovered, looked at the specks of light of heaven and earth that were being enveloped by the general trend's power in anticipation. He carefully sensed the countless specks of light of heaven and earth and the various changes that occurred in that power. The light of heaven and earth was fundamentally different from ordinary light, or even ordinary power and might. Being split into countless parts did not cause the light of heaven and earth to lose its power. In fact, it did not affect the integrity of the light of heaven and earth much either. The only difference was that the power that the light of heaven and earth could unleash was greatly weakened. After all, even though the power and integrity of the light of heaven and earth itself were not affected, all it had to do was gather into a ball and condense all its defenses or attacks into a single ball, and it would be enough to protect itself and provide powerful attacks against the opponent. But now, because his body had been divided into billions of parts, he naturally had to divide his defense into billions of parts to defend against the light of heaven and earth at every location. Only then would he be able to achieve the original effect of defending against the light of heaven and earth. Similarly, it was the same for attacks. An attack that could originally be condensed into a ball now needed to be launched from countless trillions of parts at the same time and finally condensed into a single ball to achieve the same effect. It could be said that even though this splitting was not enough to weaken the light of heaven and earth's power, it had already greatly increased the pressure that the light of heaven and earth had to endure. At this moment, Luo Fan could faintly sense that the light of heaven and earth was constantly being transmitted to him, as if it could not bear the pressure anymore. The spiritual aura contained in the light of heaven and earth had also become sluggish under this pressure. The potential in his body was stimulated crazily. All the changes that he could produce started to evolve in the billions of trillions of light of the world. He did his best to resist the power that was being extracted from the momentum that was growing stronger and stronger. At this moment, the light of heaven and earth continued to emit rattling sounds. As the sound rang out, tiny cracks began to appear on the world's light. Evidently, the light of the world couldn't endure the pressure and its structure was showing signs of collapsing. However, the light of heaven and earth was clearly not to be trifled with. Although its body was constantly cracking under the pressure and it was constantly walking towards the abyss of collapse, it was still able to withstand the pressure. However, its own power still played a role in the end. All kinds of strange characteristics continuously appeared, and it used all kinds of means to repair the cracks in the light of heaven and earth to resist the pressure from the power of the general trend. During this process, limitless power was revealed and endless transformations appeared. Around each speck of light, there seemed to be an extremely strange and mysterious cluster of worlds emerging out of thin air. There were billions and trillions of changes occurring at every moment. Countless living beings were being born, growing, and exploding in their most glorious moments to resist the terrifying pressure brought by the boundless power from the outside world. Under the pressure of the great power, the groups of worlds continued to collapse and perish. During this process, cracks appeared one after another in the light of the world, and it cracked again and again. This pressure far surpassed the emotional space-time that was originally wrapped in the light of heaven and earth. This caused the light of heaven and earth to recede bit by bit under this pressure. Although the cracks that appeared on every speck of the light of heaven and earth could be completely healed, it became more and more difficult, and the speed at which it healed became slower and slower. As for the spiritual aura, it gradually became stagnant during this process. It was as if it was shouldering a heavier and heavier burden, and was constantly approaching its limit. Sensing this, the look of anticipation on Luo Fan's face became even more intense. This seemingly unbearable state, that seemed to be on the verge of complete collapse and destruction, was an unbearable process for any metamorphosis. Just like when an ordinary person ran, there would definitely be an extremely difficult and arduous period before surpassing the limits of one's physical strength. Even lifting one's foot would seem to exhaust all one's strength. However, as long as one could endure this period of time, one's body would surpass its limit, and the originally unbearable running would become extremely easy. Now, what the light of heaven and earth was enduring was the most difficult process before surpassing its limit. As long as it could endure this process, then its spiritual aura would definitely surpass its limit and obtain a transformation that he was looking forward to. For the world, it was a transformation that was of utmost importance. How long can this process last? As this thought flashed across his mind, Luo Fan's expression became calm, and he began to quietly wait for the final outcome. While the light of heaven and earth and the power of the world fought intensely outside, within the vortex, among the many worlds that were gradually merging, the many cultivators on the fourth level of the Tao Sovereign's path had already fallen into an extremely strange state. Their focus was placed on the seal that represented the core of the situation. For the sake of fighting for the seal, their intelligence was stimulated and their power surged. All sorts of strange methods were being used. The scale of the battle had unknowingly expanded to include all cultivators, turning the region that was originally the space between the many worlds into an unimaginably vast battlefield. Here, the world group had already filled up the originally empty space, and the heaven and earth, worlds, and spacetime in this world group were completely different from the surrounding world. There seemed to be no boundary between the heaven and earth, worlds, and spacetime here. Moreover, regardless of the heaven and earth, worlds, or spacetime, there was no stability to speak of. Everything seemed so chaotic. All the energy, all the laws, and even all the grand chaos within it were born for the sake of battle. Moreover, every few breaths of time, there would be a terrifying power sweeping through the world clusters, completely overturning some of the world clusters, destroying them, or changing their appearance. Overturning the heaven and earth was an extremely common phenomenon in this place. This kind of chaos and brutality showed the state of many cultivators fighting at this moment. Such an intense battle was originally enough to cause many chain reactions, ultimately forming a terrifying ominous aura that would directly cause a calamity to descend. However, at this moment, in such a tragic battle, there seemed to be something holding on to its bottom line. No matter how intense the battle was, it did not produce any ominous aura. Nor did it cause a calamity to descend, causing all the existences participating in the battle to suffer a calamity. From another perspective, it was as if all the cultivators participating in the battle had maintained their rationality in the depths of their hearts. They knew that they had limited their power to a certain level that would not allow the situation to develop to an uncontrollable level. This situation was clearly a manifestation of the chaotic power of the general trend being completely extracted by Luo Fan. After all, no matter how intense the battle between the cultivators was, how terrifying the power they unleashed, or how intense the conflict between them was, the general trend that all of them displayed was extremely stable. The stability of the general trend meant that there was no possibility of it collapsing. It also meant that in the depths of their hearts, all the cultivators still acknowledged the fact that they and other cultivators, even their mortal enemies, were still part of the same entity. In this way, it wasn't wrong to say that there was some sort of existence holding onto their bottom line, preventing them from completely losing their rationality. There were simply too many cultivators competing for the seal. Anyone who obtained the seal would be attacked by all the other cultivators, and would have no choice but to give up on the seal in order to preserve themselves. Therefore, even though several years had passed, and the seal had passed through the hands of millions of cultivators, there was still not a single cultivator who could keep the seal for a long time. The seal was still in the hands of many cultivators, and the numerous cultivators were still constantly competing for the seal. From the looks of it, the process of competing for the seal would obviously be an extremely long process. Of course, this was actually not a big deal. At this level, time had almost become a symbol to these cultivators. For these cultivators, whether it was a few years, a few decades, a few hundred years, a few thousand years, or even tens of thousands of years, there was actually no difference. Even if it took tens of thousands of years to compete for the seal, which represented the highest authority in the fourth level of the Tao Master Path, it was absolutely worth it. In this way, naturally, they would not lose patience just because of the passing of a few years. At this time, they were still in high spirits, just like when they first began to compete for the seal a few years ago. They did not feel discouraged or give up because of the failure of so many cultivators before them. One could even imagine that in the long years to come, they would not be discouraged or give up. Among the many cultivators, the one who was the most enthusiastic was the original fourth senior brother. In the opinion of the fourth senior brother, this seal represented the authority that he'd lost. To other cultivators, this kind of authority was something that they had never obtained before. If they could obtain it, it would naturally be for the best. If they could not obtain it, it would only mean that they did not receive the corresponding benefit. However, the situation was obviously different for the fourth senior brother. The appearance of the seal represented a chance for him to regain his authority. As the fourth senior brother, before Luo Fan appeared, he was the ruler of the fourth level of the Tao Master Path. Even if the scope of this ruler was only limited to the territory of the Tao Master Path, it did not change the fact that he was the ruler. At that time, how awe-inspiring was he! How rich was the resources that he controlled! However, all of this changed after Luo Fan appeared. Not only did he lose the authority of the ruler, even he himself had been treated as a resource. He lost his sense of self, and was thrown into a powerhouse's world group to help the evolution of that powerhouse's world group. This kind of experience was even more difficult for him than other cultivators. Under such circumstances, there was actually a chance to regain his authority and even surpass his original authority. How could he not go crazy? After all, to him, the significance of the seal was not only the authority, but also the restoration of his own body. Although the fourth senior brother's strength was not enough to be compared to Luo Fan, he had an absolute advantage over the other Tao masters and independent cultivators. If it was a one-on-one battle, he might have already snatched the seal from the beginning. However, the current battle was not one-on-one. For many cultivators with extraordinary wisdom, it was almost their instinct to measure the difference in strength between them. Under such circumstances, the fourth senior brother, who was the most proactive and powerful, became the focus of most cultivators. Almost everything that the fourth senior brother wanted to accomplish would be stopped by a large number of cultivators, regardless of whether they knew what he wanted to do. It could be said that the fourth senior brother was completely the target of this kind of battle. There was almost nothing that he could do smoothly. In this way, even though the fourth senior brother was much stronger than the other cultivators, he could only follow the crowd of cultivators. Not to mention seizing the seal, he couldn't even touch the seal. At this moment, a voice entered the fourth senior brother's ears. "Stop thinking about it. It's impossible for you to get the seal." The fourth senior brother was extremely familiar with this voice. The moment he heard it, his heart trembled, and he turned his head in a certain direction. There, the middle-aged independent cultivator from the fifth floor quietly floated there and looked at him with a faint smile on his face. Seeing the fourth senior brother look over, the middle-aged independent cultivator spread out his hands and smiled. "Like me, I would never do something that is destined to be futile." Seeing the fourth senior brother talk to Luo Fan, a trace of fear appeared in the fourth senior brother's eyes. Although he did not know how powerful this person was, he knew that this person was definitely countless times stronger than him. Chapter 2268. The middle-aged itinerant cultivator smiled and said, "Of course I'm interested. However, I know that no matter how interested I am, it's impossible for me to obtain the seal." "Why?" The fourth senior brother was slightly taken aback. If what the middle-aged itinerant cultivator said was true, then what was the point of fighting for the seal with hundreds of millions of cultivators? Is there a need to ask? Not to mention the fact that there were so many people staring at the seal, without a method to suppress everyone's combined strength, it was impossible to contain the seal. Just the origin of the seal was enough to determine this result. As the fourth senior brother, you should know, right? The middle-aged itinerant cultivator smiled disdainfully. The fourth senior brother's expression changed slightly when he heard this. He had thought about this before, but his instincts prevented him from thinking too deeply about it. As a result, he had unknowingly figured out the situation that all cultivators should be able to figure out. It was only when the middle-aged itinerant cultivator reminded him that he came back to his senses. Wasn't the truth just as he had said? Right now, all the cultivators were staring at the seal. Even if they could obtain the seal, where would they find the time to refine it? The tens of thousands of cultivators who obtained the seal and then lost it were proof of this. Not to mention that the seal came from a powerful itinerant cultivator. It could be said that it was completely under the control of that powerful itinerant cultivator. Under such circumstances, even if they paid a great price to subdue all the cultivators and obtain the seal, whether or not they could keep the seal depended on the itinerant cultivator's will. In this way, whether or not they could obtain the seal was not dependent on the outcome of their competition. If that was the case, what was the point of them fighting for it? For a moment, the fourth senior brother's expression became dull, and an indescribable despair appeared in his eyes. Is there no hope for us to transcend? Will we be stuck in this state forever? He murmured, his face ashen, and his eyes glazed over. The middle-aged itinerant cultivator smiled and said, "Of course, it's impossible for us to live forever. That person is an expert. Although I don't know what his cultivation direction is, I know that the fourth level is definitely not his final destination. One day, he would leave the fourth floor and ascend to the fifth floor. At that time, we will regain our freedom. How long will that take? I'm afraid it's billions of trillion years old." Fourth senior brother's eyes lit up at first, but then he became dispirited again. Moreover, didn't you say that the direction he's choosing now is fundamentally wrong, and ascending to immortality is simply far away? The middle-aged cultivator didn't feel embarrassed at being exposed. Instead, he laughed and said, "Indeed, his cultivation direction is wrong. However, you have to admit the fact that he is an expert." As for Luo Fan being a powerhouse, the fourth senior brother naturally acknowledged it. After all the cultivators on the fourth floor, whether they were rogue cultivators or disciples of Tao sovereigns, had fallen into the hands of Luo Fan and were completely at his mercy. Under such circumstances, if Luo Fan was not a real expert, then what were they? Only by admitting that Luo Fan was an expert could they, who had been defeated by Luo Fan, not appear so weak. Since he is an expert, the mistake naturally can't be permanent. I believe that he will soon find the right path and ascend to immortality. The middle-aged itinerant cultivator said with a smile. You don't seem worried at all. The fourth senior brother looked at the middle-aged itinerant cultivator, who seemed to be in a good mood, and could not help but feel a little strange. After all, seriously speaking, the middle-aged itinerant cultivator was also a prisoner of that expert. Compared to ordinary rogue cultivators, the disciples of Tao sovereigns like them had a powerful backer, and there was a chance that expert would not dare to act recklessly. As a rogue cultivator, the middle-aged itinerant cultivator had even returned to the fourth floor from the fifth floor against the Tao sovereign path. Not only did he not have a backer, but the expert could also do whatever he wanted without fear of being counterattacked. Even the Tao sovereign path would be covetous of him, and once he showed a flaw, he would be directly captured and thrown into the Tao sovereign prison. With all these disadvantages, the middle-aged itinerant cultivator's situation was much worse than the fourth senior brother's. However, even under such circumstances, The middle-aged itinerant cultivator did not seem worried at all. Instead, it was as if everything was under his control. How could this not make the fourth senior brother curious? I just thought it through, the middle-aged itinerant cultivator said with a smile. Thought through what? The fourth senior brother's expression became even more strange. How could such a situation be solved by thinking it through? The expression of the middle-aged itinerant cultivator made him feel even more incredulous. Tell me, what hatred do we have with that person? The middle-aged itinerant cultivator asked. As he spoke, he did not wait for the fourth senior brother's answer. After all, this matter was placed in front of him, and there could not be any other answer. Therefore, he directly said, "No. There is no hatred between us and him at all. Even though I caused him some trouble before, in his eyes, I believe that it was just a little trouble. He definitely wouldn't think that it was some kind of hatred. Similarly, you should be the same." And then? The fourth senior brother murmured thoughtfully. Since there is no hatred, why did he treat us like this? Other than his own cultivation, I can't think of any other reason. The middle-aged itinerant cultivator let out a long sigh, as if he was relieved. This made the fourth senior brother feel even more strange. Why did it seem like a heavy burden had been lifted from his shoulders after he said that? Could it be that this sentence represented some special meaning? There's no reaction even after I said it. It seems like my guess is correct. The middle-aged itinerant cultivator smiled, but there was an inexplicable sense of loss in his expression. It was as if one had treated someone as a lifelong enemy, only to realize in the end that the other party did not take him seriously at all. The other party merely treated him as a passerby or a soldier on the side of the road. Although this place was already out of the world cluster of the powerhouse, based on the powerhouse's previous behavior, it was clear that this place was still under his complete control. Therefore, it could be said that the conversation they were having now was as if they were speaking to the powerhouse face to face. In this way, every word they said was clearly heard by the powerhouse. In this way, if there was any problem with what they said, or if they triggered something, the powerhouse would definitely react. Based on this, it was understandable for the middle-aged itinerant cultivator to behave this way. Since his guess about Luo Fan's intentions did not cause any change, it was obvious that Luo Fan had tacitly agreed with him. Not only did this verify his own guess, but it also allowed him to realize the slim chance of survival that he and the others had originally thought of. In this way, it was only natural for the middle-aged itinerant cultivator to behave this way. The fourth senior brother seemed to be deep in thought and vaguely understood a lot of things. Countless thoughts kept appearing and dissipating in his mind. So, as long as we change our stance and work hard to cooperate with him, we will no longer be targeted by him, and we will be able to safely get through this long period of imprisonment, he said after a long time. This is the most negative approach. I think, as a disciple of the Tao Master, you should know some more positive approaches. The middle-aged itinerant cultivator smiled faintly. Hearing this, the fourth senior brother finally understood why the middle-aged itinerant cultivator would talk to him. It was obvious that the middle-aged itinerant cultivator had his eyes on the inheritance of the Tao Master. Impossible! At that moment, he said resolutely. There was not the slightest hint of compromise in his expression, only the firmest determination. The inheritance of the Tao Master was the foundation of his identity as a disciple of the Tao Master. Although the Tao Master did not say that the inheritance could not be leaked, as a disciple of the Tao Master, if he could not even protect his own inheritance, how could he still call himself a disciple of the Tao Master? How could he be qualified to be the fourth senior brother? The middle-aged itinerant cultivator only smiled and said, "I didn't say anything, it's all just your imagination." The fourth senior brother was unmoved. Although the middle-aged itinerant cultivator did not say anything, his meaning was obvious. Even if he was just an itinerant cultivator, he would definitely be able to understand what he meant, let alone the fourth senior brother who had controlled the fourth level of the Tao Master's path for a long time. The middle-aged itinerant cultivator sighed when he saw that the fourth senior brother's expression did not change at all. Why can't your brain think? Brain teaser? Fourth senior brother didn't understand what he meant. This kind of thing had nothing to do with thinking. No matter how good his brain was, it was impossible for him to let his Tao Master's inheritance be leaked. Although I have never obtained the Tao Master's inheritance, I think it must be completely targeted at you. Even if others obtained it, it would not be of much use to them. Perhaps the Tao Master's inheritance is extremely precious to you, but to others, especially to that expert, it is just an insignificant reference. Even if you want to pass the inheritance to him, it is hard to say how much help it will be to him, the middle-aged itinerant cultivator said with a smile. What do you mean? You're the one who said yes, but you're the one who said no. The fourth senior brother frowned. I said I didn't say anything. Everything is your own idea, what does it have to do with me? The middle-aged itinerant cultivator said helplessly. Then what do you mean by a more active approach? The fourth senior brother finally asked directly. Can't you contact a higher-level person? Then why don't you get some of the higher-level mysteries and give it to that person? Won't that promote his cultivation? The middle-aged itinerant cultivator finally revealed his answer helplessly. Hearing this, the fourth senior brother was stunned at first, and then his eyes shone like two dazzling suns. The middle-aged itinerant cultivator did not say it very clearly, but he completely understood what the other party meant. If I get the higher-level mysteries and give it to that person, he will know that compared to the higher level, the fourth level is not enough at all, and the efficiency of cultivation is much lower. In this way, he will definitely be tempted, and maybe he will immediately change his cultivation method and directly use the fastest speed to directly ascend to the fifth level. At that time, we will also be free. The fourth senior brother thought to himself, and there was an inexplicable excitement in his eyes. He believed that this was the real meaning of the middle-aged itinerant cultivator. As for saying that there was no hatred, and that he would help that expert to cultivate and so on, it was just a whitewash. The middle-aged itinerant cultivator looked at the fourth senior brother's constantly changing expression and breathed a sigh of relief. I finally understand this is too difficult. It seems that the difference in the way of thinking between us itinerant cultivators and the disciples of the Tao Master is greater than I imagined. If you were an itinerant cultivator, you would have understood what I was going to say as soon as I opened my mouth. If I had the ability to receive the mysteries from the higher level, why would I need to talk nonsense with this kind of disciple? Such a thought flashed through his mind at this time. The inheritance of the Tao Master was many times more powerful than that of the itinerant cultivators. There were all kinds of incredible methods in the eyes of ordinary itinerant cultivators, such as the method to connect to the higher level of the road of Tao Master and receive the mysteries from it. It was absolutely unimaginable for ordinary itinerant cultivators. However, for the disciples of the Tao Master, it was just a simple method. He believed that the fourth senior brother, as the strongest of all the disciples of the Tao Master in the fourth level of the road of Tao Master, must have such ability. He even suspected that the fourth senior brother was willing to be the fourth senior brother here, instead of ascending to a higher level, because he could constantly absorb the mysteries of the fifth level to improve himself in the fourth level. Otherwise, with his foundation, he could have ascended to a higher level long ago. In fact, the middle-aged itinerant cultivator was lucky. The fourth senior brother did indeed have the ability to communicate with the higher level and absorb the mysteries from the higher level of the road of Tao Master. However, the reason why he stayed in the fourth level instead of ascending was not for this reason. The reason why he stayed here was actually based on the basic cultivation concept of almost all the disciples of the Tao Master, that was, one must cultivate to the limit in each level, and then choose to ascend when there was no more progress. If one did not reach the point where there was no more progress, in the eyes of the disciples of the Tao Master, it would mean that one's foundation was not stable, and it would ruin one's future. It was precisely because of this concept of cultivation that most of the disciples of the Tao Master in the fourth level chose to continue cultivating in the fourth level instead of ascending, even though they already had the foundation to ascend. Chapter 2269. The middle-aged individual cultivator's misunderstanding did not affect their communication at this time. The fourth senior brother's emotions surged. He only felt that the middle-aged individual cultivator's suggestion had too much room for manipulation. If it was done well, it might really be possible to send that expert to a higher level faster, and all the cultivators would regain their freedom. Let's do it. In the end, he gritted his teeth and spat out these two words. Seeing that the fourth senior brother had made up his mind, the middle-aged individual cultivator from the fifth level showed an inexplicable smile on his face. He also had great expectations in his heart. He came from the fifth level of the Tao Master's path, so he was already very familiar with the mysteries of the fifth level. He knew very well how much temptation the mysteries of the fifth level could bring to the cultivators of the fourth level. He could even imagine how fast Luo Fan would be if the mysteries of the fifth level appeared here, and how quickly he would forget about the world group and all the cultivators on the fourth level and directly devote himself to the mysteries of the fifth level. Perhaps we don't even need to wait for him to ascend. As long as these mysteries appear, he will no longer care about us. With this thought, he could not help but smile faintly. When he glanced at the fourth senior brother, there was a faint hint of pity in his eyes. As the passage of the mysteries of the fifth level, the mysteries were the most attractive to the experts, and the fourth senior brother would be more valued. He could even predict how the expert would imprison the fourth senior brother once the mysteries appeared, search his soul, and extract the power of the mysteries of a higher level. However, it was obvious that this sacrifice was completely the fourth senior brother's sacrifice, and there would not be any negative impact on the other cultivators apart from the fourth senior brother. In this way, he naturally had no obligation to remind the fourth senior brother. The fourth senior brother did not think so much. At this time, he only felt that the fog in front of him had been dispelled, and a new world had opened up in front of him. All kinds of inspiration constantly emerged from the bottom of his heart, and turned into various logical solutions in his mind. To extract the mysteries of the fifth level, I need to first communicate with the fifth level. To achieve this, I need to set up a formation. That powerhouse restricted my ability to summon the powerhouse from the fifth floor, but he didn't restrict my ability to set up the formation. As long as he knows my goal, he probably won't stop me at the end. With these thoughts in mind, he began to step forward in the void. As he walked, clusters of mysterious power were left behind wherever he passed by. They were like living creatures, constantly wriggling, condensing and outlining in a strange way, gradually turning into all kinds of complicated patterns, runes, talismans, and lines. As he continued to advance, the power left behind by these things continued to increase. By the time he had advanced several tens of millions of steps, the power had increased to several tens of millions of clumps. Moreover, because they were growing, expanding, and evolving at every single moment, the tens of millions of balls of energy had unknowingly expanded into one, forming an incomparably grand, complicated, and bizarre formation diagram. Although it seemed like he was constantly moving forward, due to the mysteries of the void, when he took the last step, the fourth senior brother directly appeared at the place where he started. In other words, it was the place where the power had expanded to the largest scale at the beginning. As the head and tail were connected, the tens of millions of balls of energy finally formed a complete whole, and all kinds of strange roars began to be transmitted from the tens of millions of balls of energy. It was unknown how many lights, how much energy, how many living beings, how many spacetimes, how many worlds, and how many heavens and earth flashed from the countless balls of energy at this moment. The speed at which all of the powers spread increased rapidly. In just a short span of a dozen breaths, all of the powers had already spread to the extreme, directly filling up the circular space in the middle of the encirclement of countless powers. In other words, at this moment, the circular area formed by the countless balls of energy had turned into a disc-shaped area. When this disc was formed, the fourth senior brother's tensed face finally relaxed. Before this, he was worried that Luo Fan would stop him. After all, the way he set up the formation was similar to how he summoned senior sister Mei back then. He would not be surprised if Luo Fan misunderstood that he wanted to summon a powerhouse from a higher level to descend again. In other words, when he was setting up the array just now, he was worried that Luo Fan would suddenly stop him or even punish him at every moment. Fortunately, he's already seen through everything and knows that I'm not summoning a senior brother or senior sister from the 5th level. He secretly rejoiced, but at the same time, he felt an inexplicable sense of humiliation. In reality, he had the opportunity to reverse the formation during the process, changing the summoning formation into a summoning formation. However, the fate of the middle-aged individual cultivator from the 5th level and senior sister Mei's fate told him that even if he summoned a powerhouse from the 5th level, it would not be of much use. Unless he could surpass his own limits and summon a powerhouse from a higher level, he would not have a chance of defeating Luo Fan. Of course, this was only a feeling he had when he did not know what had happened to the waxen middle-aged man from the 6th level. If he knew what had happened to the waxen middle-aged man, he would definitely rejoice at his cautiousness. In comparison, the efficiency of summoning a powerhouse to deal with Luo Fan was obviously lower than directly summoning a mystery to descend and send Luo Fan to a higher level. Although this kind of understanding was rational, it also represented that his confidence had been completely destroyed, and it also represented that he could no longer resist Luo Fan anymore. The 4th senior brother's humiliation was because he was well aware of the changes in his heart. However, the 4th senior brother didn't have the mood to care about these humiliating things anymore. This was because the formation had already begun to operate. It was obviously not an easy task to activate such a summoning formation of a higher level. It went without saying how much energy it would consume. Even if the formation could continuously absorb the boundless Genesis energy from the 4th level after it was activated, the control of the energy and the formation was essential. Evidently, with the 4th senior brother's strength, just controlling the energy and the formation was enough to put him under great pressure. He had no choice but to be fully focused. At this moment, the 4th senior brother's eyes narrowed, and his mind directly fused with the formation. In a daze, he seemed to have turned into a willow catkin facing a storm. His mind was swaying in the boundless storm, and he could not control it. He was already mentally prepared for such an encounter. Naturally, he wouldn't lose his composure because of this sudden change. Instead, he instantly grasped the crucial core of this endless storm and began to use his meager strength to try his best to reverse the development of this storm. He changed the chaos within and tried his best to turn the power within towards the direction of order. It went without saying how difficult it was for a willow catkin to completely change and reverse the storm that filled the heavens and earth. Even though the 4th senior brother had the inheritance of a Tao sovereign, he still spent tens of millions of years before he barely managed to do it. Of course, those tens of millions of years were only the time within the formation. Ordinary spacetime could be independent from the outside world, not to mention this mysterious formation that even contained the heavens and earth. It couldn't be more normal for time to be independent. In fact, the tens of millions of years that the 4th senior brother felt was only a few days in the outside world. Over the past few days, the inside of the spell formation had been in a turbulent state. Countless runes, talismans, lines, diagrams, and characters were frantically circulating, changing, combining, collapsing, twisting, reforming, changing, twisting. When the final adjustment was completed, the entire formation became extremely flat, and all the changes within it had completely calmed down. The huge formation seemed to have suddenly turned into an incomparably calm and deep pool, quietly fixed in the void, motionless. At this time, the fourth senior brother seemed to suddenly wake up from a dream. He could not stop his body from retreating and finally almost fell to the ground. His face turned pale for a while before he recovered. With the fourth senior brother's realm, he would not change even if the sky and earth were destroyed. Now that he had become so pale in order to operate the formation, it was enough to show how much energy it consumed for him to operate the formation. Please enjoy. The fourth senior brother murmured and looked up at the sky. There was a kind of expectation in his eyes, but also a kind of inexplicable helplessness and humiliation. He actually did it. At this time, the middle-aged rogue cultivator murmured with an inexplicable shock in his eyes. The middle-aged rogue cultivator, who was very familiar with the mystery of the fifth level, naturally knew that there was an aura behind the mirror formed by the formation, which belonged to the fifth level of the Tao Master's path. The existence of this aura obviously meant that this formation could really surpass the shackles of the Tao Master's path and communicate with the fifth level from the fourth level. If I rush in now, can I return to the fifth level? At this moment, such a thought suddenly flashed in his mind. It had been billions of years since he went back to the fourth level from the fifth level of the Tao Master's path. For a long time, he did not think that he had any sense of belonging to the fifth level. But this time, when he felt the aura of the fifth level again, he suddenly found that he was very eager to go to the fifth level. He actually had such a deep hatred for the fourth layer. However, he was ultimately not the kind of person who would lose his rationality in a moment of impulse. As his thoughts spun in his mind, he quickly suppressed this ridiculous impulse. It's just a formation, after all, it's not a passage. It's already against the natural order to bring down the mystery. How can it allow me to go back? He sighed to himself. Although bringing down the mystery also went against the rules of the Tao Master's path, it was after all just a little bit. But if he directly bypassed the rules of ascension and directly built a passage, it would obviously overturn the entire structure of the Tao Master's path. Obviously, the nature of that was completely different. If he dared to say that the power of the Tao Master's prison did not come down, it was simply an insult to his wisdom. At this moment, a figure appeared out of thin air in the formation. Both the fourth senior brother and the middle-aged individual cultivator were very familiar with this figure. It was the figure of Luo Fan. The figure seemed illusory, real, and illusory. Obviously, it was just a projection that contained a little bit of power. However, whether it was the fourth senior brother or the middle-aged disbanded cultivator, they did not dare to underestimate his actions. Their expressions became extremely solemn, and they looked at Luo Fan as if they were looking at a giant that could crush them to death with a slight movement. Is this the fifth level? After the projection of Luo Fan appeared, he murmured. Previously, although his focus was on the battle between the power extracted from the general trend and his own light of heaven and earth, he was actually a little vigilant about the various things inside the vortex. If nothing happened, he naturally would not split his attention here. However, the discussion between the fourth senior brother and the middle-aged individual cultivator could not be described as nothing happened. Therefore, from the beginning when the two of them met, he had already seen everything. He was even more interested in the discussion between the two of them. Although he did not think that the purpose of entering the path of Tao Master was to constantly ascend. But he also understood that the higher the level of a Tao Master was, the more profound the mystery would be. The mysteries contained in the fifth level would definitely be more profound than the mysteries contained in the fourth level. Under such circumstances, the fourth senior brother wanted to extract the mystery of the fifth level and let him comprehend it. Naturally, he could not refuse. Of course, it was needless to say whether he would directly give up what he was doing now because of this. Even the middle-aged individual cultivator would return to the 4th level to cultivate after ascending to the 5th level. How could he abandon the treasures contained in the 4th level just for a little benefit? At this time, on the calm surface of the deep pool, where Luo Fan stood, ripples began to spread in all directions. Following these ripples, strands of mysterious mysteries leaked out. Gurgling sounds could be heard, as if there was gas continuously gushing out from within. Under the control of Luo Fan, these mysteries constantly gathered in front of his hands and gradually turned into an indescribable, invisible existence. This existence could not be described with any words. Chapter 2270. Grasping this almost untouchable mystery in his hand, Luo Fan's heart surged with all kinds of indescribable insight. It was as if there were strands of information constantly penetrating into his body and mind through the mystery in his hand. These strands of information were extremely mysterious, wonderful, and even indescribable. He could only feel that all aspects of himself seemed to be constantly improving and sublimating with these information. Among them, the most obvious change was his world-view of law. At this moment, his world-view of law seemed to have turned into a dry sponge, crazily devouring the endless information. It was trying its best to mince, purify, transform, and integrate the endless information into the inside, transforming it into the perfect and growing resources of his world-view of law. What a mysterious mystery! After a long time, he could not help but sigh with emotion. Even Luo Fan could not figure out the source of these mysteries. What he had obtained now was merely the purest of the mysteries that did not contain any special characteristics of the source. Under such circumstances, even if Luo Fan's realm was profound, his knowledge was vast, and his strength was formidable, he still couldn't deduce what kind of existence these profound mysteries were derived from. This was obviously because this formation could only bring in the mysteries, but could not bring in anything other than the mysteries. If it were not for this restriction, no matter how strong the 4th senior brother was, it would be absolutely impossible for him to purify the 5th level of the mystery to this extent. However, because this was only a mystery left under the restriction of the formation, compared to the real mystery of the 5th level, this kind of mystery must be a small part of it. Even so, it was extremely broken, just a small part that was drifting away. Even at this time, Luo Fan had gained a lot of benefits from this mystery, but he was very clear that if he regarded these mysteries as the real mystery of the 5th level of the Tao Master's Road, he would not be able to see Mount Tai with a single leaf before his eyes. With a slight movement of his heart, his perspective began to undergo a subtle change. The wisps of profoundness that were originally invisible and intangible, and could not be seen or even sensed, were revealed in his eyes. Or rather, they had obtained the form that he had given them. They were wisps of strange air currents. They seeped out from the ripples on the surface of the calm pool and gathered in his hands. Gradually, they turned into a larger and larger air mass in his hands. However, even though the air mass was barely round, there were gaps and fractures everywhere. Air constantly seeped out of the fractures and dissipated into the void. Because of this change, the air mass began to stabilize after growing to a certain extent, maintaining a fixed size and shape. After changing his perspective to a state where he could see through the mysteries, he naturally didn't need to wait for the mysteries to automatically pour information into his mind. Instead, he could already turn around and actively seek out the information he needed from the mysteries. His heart stirred slightly, and his perception directly probed into the mysteries. As his perception probed into it, the layers of the mystery's structure contained infinite principles and endless information, as if they had turned into a large ancient book, began to unfold in his eyes. It's really broken. After a long time, he sighed and stopped seeking information and principles in the mysteries. With a gentle wave of his hand, the mysteries in his hand dissipated. With this action, The ripples on the surface of the deep pool, as if a breeze had suddenly arisen, began to become chaotic. All kinds of slight waves appeared on the surface of the deep pool, and the waves in different directions quickly scattered the original orderly circles of ripples. In a short while, the surface of the deep pool revealed its original fundamental structure, which was composed of countless runes, talismans, lines, patterns, words, and so on. It was an extremely complex structure composed of countless runes, talismans, lines, patterns, words, and so on. Seeing this change, both the fourth senior brother and the middle-aged individual cultivator from the fifth level were shocked. What's going on? Does he not like the mysteries of the fifth level? How is it possible? He clearly hasn't reached the fifth level, and this mystery should have an extraordinary attraction to him. It should be impossible for him to break free from this attraction. This thought flashed through the middle-aged cultivator's mind. Although his expression did not change much, his eyes were filled with shock. At this moment, the feeling of losing control of things when he faced Luo Fan once again emerged from the bottom of his heart. As for the fourth senior brother, he was even more panic-stricken at this moment. After all, he had spent a lot of cultivation method to build this formation, and its power was almost at his limit. If this wasn't enough to satisfy this expert, then he didn't know what else he could do to make him satisfied. He couldn't help but panic when he thought about how that powerhouse was forcing him to satisfy him. At this time, Luo Fan sighed and said to the fourth senior brother, "There is a reason why the various mysteries are distributed in different levels on the Tao Master's path." His words, like the morning bell and evening drum, blasted into the ears of the fourth senior brother, causing him to suddenly wake up from the shroud of all kinds of negative emotions. His eyes became clear and his expression became thoughtful. Could it be that the mysteries of the fifth level should not appear in the fourth level? He could not help but ask. Originally, he was extremely proud of being able to draw down the mysteries of the fifth level. He even wanted to use this to negotiate with Luo Fan. Under such circumstances, his ability was criticized by Luo Fan as worthless, so he naturally felt extremely uncomfortable. You can say that. If the mysteries of the fourth level and the fifth level were not incompatible, why would the Tao Master's path separate them? Luo Fan just smiled and said, "If you want to summon the mysteries of the fifth level, then you need to resist the endless mysteries of the fourth level. Moreover, the mysteries that are summoned will also be washed by the mysteries of the fourth level. In the end, the mysteries that are left will not only become broken, but will also be distorted by the mysteries of the fourth level. There are not many benefits to absorbing them, but there are many disadvantages." The fourth senior brother was dumbfounded by his words. Dividing the Tao Master's path into these levels and distributing all kinds of mysteries in each level was the arrangement of the Tao Masters who had created the Tao Master's path. Obviously, this arrangement could not be without reason. The fourth senior brother had absolute faith in the Tao Master, and even if the Tao Master wanted to erase him, he would feel that he should be erased. Under such circumstances, he naturally agreed with this arrangement and felt that it was absolutely necessary. Under such circumstances, Luo Fan used the structure of the Tao Master's path as a reason to speculate about the mysteries of the fifth level and the fourth level, but he believed it immediately. So it's like this. Doesn't this mean that my divine sense has always been illusory of the fifth level? Then, what I have comprehended before is wrong, he murmured, with an inexplicable look of confusion in his eyes. Obviously, Luo Fan was not in the mood to help him answer his confusion. He just turned to look at the middle-aged individual cultivator. When the middle-aged individual cultivator's heart was in his throat, his eyes flashed and his figure slowly dissipated. In a short while, he had already disappeared into the formation. Obviously, Luo Fan had taken back the projection. What a pity! After all, his strength is insufficient. If his strength is strong enough, there should be no problem for him to completely summon the fifth level of the occult. If he can summon the complete occult, under the pressure and repulsion of the fourth level of the occult, he will definitely be able to hold on for a longer time. Maybe he can absorb it. This thought appeared in the mind of Luo Fan at this time. With a slight thought, all the information and gains he had obtained from the profound mysteries were easily cut off, allowing his mind and his worldview to return to the state it was before he had accepted all the information and principles within the profound mysteries. This kind of completely cutting off all the information and comprehensions obtained was naturally an incredible achievement for ordinary practitioners. But for him, it was just an instinct that could be done in a moment. After all, he was the one who had forcefully condensed the blade of wisdom to cut open his soul and completely cut off all the comprehension related to the existence of a true sage. Compared to the understanding and comprehension of the existence of the true divine level, what was the information and principles of the fifth level of the Tao Master's path that he had just obtained? Naturally, it could be cut off at any time. After cutting off all of this, he turned his mind back to the battle between the power of the general trend and his own light of heaven and earth. Now, under the pressure of the power of the general trend, the light of heaven and earth was gradually retreating. In the process, its own potential was constantly being stimulated, releasing a powerful and amazing power. Although the light of heaven and earth was constantly retreating, there was always a stroke of genius at the last moment that allowed it to recover, regroup, and continue to fight. And in the battle between the practitioners, the power of the general trend was constantly being born, constantly sublimated, and continuously replenished, making up for the consumption of the power of the general trend and the light of heaven and earth in the process of fighting, and maintaining its advantage over the light of heaven and earth so that it would not be reversed. In this process, all kinds of mysterious and incomprehensible means were constantly displayed between them. Heaven and earth, the world, and the space-time were like small combat units, constantly being born and constantly destroyed between the two. As for all sorts of strange divine abilities, all sorts of unimaginably profound powers, and all sorts of powers that were exquisite to the point of making any cultivator wish they were dead from shame, they were everywhere and innumerable. Even if Luo Fan did not wholeheartedly want to comprehend anything from the battle between the two, when watching the battlefield, he could still constantly absorb nutrients from the various scenes produced by the battle between the two. He could feel his understanding of the light of heaven and earth, the fourth level of the road to Tao Master, the group of worlds, and even his understanding of the worldview of laws was deepening every moment. This speed of learning was even comparable to the speed of directly receiving the mysteries from the fifth level of the road to Tao Master. This was also one of the reasons why Luo Fan did not miss the formation at all. After discovering that the mysteries in it had been distorted, he immediately let go of it and took the initiative to completely cut off all the information and mysteries he had previously obtained. And it was also an important reason, after all, although the mysteries had been distorted, they still contained the mysteries of the fourth and fifth level. As long as he spent some time analyzing the way they were distorted, he might be able to obtain the mysteries from the fifth level again. If he had no choice, Luo Fan would pinch his nose and accept it. It would take a lot of energy and a lot of time to analyze the distorted mysteries and obtain the mysteries from the fifth level. However, it was obvious that he had too many choices now. The mysteries revealed by the battle between the light of heaven and earth and the power of the general trend were more important to him, and it was easier for him to absorb. He did not need to waste time and energy analyzing them at all. He could use them and turn them into his own benefit. Under such circumstances, what choice would he make? Was there even a need to say? While Luo Fan was leisurely comprehending the mysteries revealed by the conflict between the light of heaven and earth and the power of the general trend, the fourth senior brother and the middle-aged individual cultivator were caught in a strange atmosphere. It was because of the instigation of the middle-aged individual cultivator that the fourth senior brother had spent so much effort to build this formation. But now he found that all this was useless. Luo Fan did not care about the formation he built, nor did he care about the mysteries of the fifth level of the road to Tao Master that were revealed by the formation. This obviously made the two people, who had a tacit understanding, feel awkward. In the end, it was the middle-aged individual cultivator who sighed and said, "It seems that I didn't think it through. For this formation, I paid the price of 3 billion years of cultivation." The fourth senior brother looked rather numb and did not even look at the middle-aged individual cultivator. Hearing this, the middle-aged individual cultivator smiled and said, "It's just 3 billion years. It's nothing. If you're willing, I might be able to compensate you." The fourth senior brother's value had increased a lot in his eyes since he could communicate with the fifth level. Therefore, he was not willing to fall out with him at this time. Hearing this, the fourth senior brother smiled coldly and said, "There's no need. Your method is brilliant. We'd better not contact each other anymore." As he spoke, he casually waved his hand at the huge formation in front of him. As he waved his hand, the endless power contained in the entire formation began to tremble rapidly. Chapter 2271. Seeing the fourth senior brother leave, the middle-aged itinerant cultivator sighed. However, it was just a sigh. Apart from that, there was nothing else he could do. After all, although the fourth senior brother was quite valuable to him, and he would normally be willing to spend a lot of effort to dig out the fourth senior brother's value and take him for himself. However, the current situation was obviously not the time to do that. For him now, it was more important to deal with Luo Fan and the extremely terrible situation in front of him. In comparison, the fourth senior brother's extremely high value was nothing. "If I don't get involved, he might use other means to force me." The middle-aged rogue cultivator sighed inwardly. His figure turned into a ray of light and directly rushed toward the battlefield between the cultivators. With his strength that far surpassed almost all the other cultivators, it was almost impossible for him to take the seal that many cultivators were fighting for himself. However, it was absolutely not a problem for him to ensure his own safety while holding back. Therefore, his participation only prevented him from leaving the battlefield. The impact on the entire battlefield was quite small. It did not make the battle more intense, nor did it make the battle more stable. Luo Fan did not pay much attention to the middle-aged itinerant cultivator's choice. For him, the power that could be extracted from the general trend was enough for him to use. It was enough for the pressure of the light of heaven and earth. In the situation where his plan was not affected, he was obviously quite tolerant. Even if the fourth senior brother did not put in the effort, he did not care. Of course, this was only when he had enough power. If he felt that the power extracted from the general trend was not enough, he would make the battlefield more chaotic and turbulent. He needed to make the battlefield even more chaotic and turbulent. As such, he should be the first to deal with the middle-aged cultivator's behavior. Time passed bit by bit. Unknowingly, 1,000 years had passed. This 1,000 years of time was not 1,000 years of time in some place where the flow of time was even faster. Instead, it was 1,000 years of time where Luo Fan was right now. In other words, it was the 1,000 years that the power from the general trend and the split light of the world had experienced in this location. After 1,000 years, the battle between the power of the general trend and the light of heaven and earth had reached a peak. At this moment, the power that erupted from the two was enough to completely wipe out any cultivator that was fighting in the vortex. It did not matter if the cultivator was a disciple of a Tao master or an itinerant cultivator. Under such an intense conflict, the various impacts and chaotic fluctuations had already formed various indescribable mysterious structures. It naturally changed the nature of the endless creation power in the surroundings. Outside the vortex, a strange spherical region was formed that was gradually independent of the creation power in the outside world. Such an independent region looked extremely obvious from the outside. Although it was much smaller than the vortex, Its scale was already comparable and could be considered to be on the same level. And Luo Fan was wrapped in this strange spherical region. His mind was fused with the light of heaven and earth. As the light of heaven and earth dispersed into countless parts, he sensed the changes that were happening to the light of heaven and earth. After 1,000 years of terrifying conflict, at this moment, the spiritual aura that existed in the light of heaven and earth had been suppressed to a certain extent. Over the past 1,000 years, the limits of the spiritual aura had been broken through time and time again. Although it was still a spiritual aura and had not truly transformed into the will of the world, compared to the beginning, this spiritual aura was many times stronger. Looking over now, the light in the light of heaven and earth had become extremely dazzling, like suns of various sizes. If not for the fact that Luo Fan was the owner of the light of heaven and earth, even he would not be able to see the appearance of the light of heaven and earth. He could only see the outlines of suns of various sizes placed in front of him. And this light was not like before. It was the manifestation of the power of the light of heaven and earth. Instead, it was the light of the spiritual aura. Compared to before, this light looked the same at first glance. However, if one looked carefully, they would discover that this light was not real. It was just a natural concealment effect formed in the depths of one's mind, soul, and will. If there really was an existence without any spiritual aura, soul, or mind looking over, they would discover that the light of heaven and earth was no different from before. It was still wrapped by the power extracted from the general trend, and it was just specks of light of various sizes. At this moment, although the countless specks of light were separated from each other, the light that they emitted was completely connected. At every moment, there was endless information, endless fluctuations, and endless subtle light circulating between the many specks of light. The entire structure looked like a huge network that was brewing something. Or rather, in the center of this huge network, there was something that was attacking the network, wanting to break out of it. In fact, this change had lasted for hundreds of years since it first appeared. It could be said that 1,000 years ago, this change had already begun not long after the light of heaven and earth's changes stagnated and broke through again and again. However, now that it had lasted for hundreds of years, this change had clearly brewed to its limit. On this day, Luo Fan, who had absorbed the endless mysteries that appeared from the battle between the light of heaven and earth and the general trend's power, returned to his senses. He slowly retreated, and at the same time, a trace of understanding flashed in his heart. The result will be out soon. His movements seemed slow, but his speed was astonishingly fast. Almost at the same time, his figure had already appeared outside the independent spherical region formed by the battle between the general trend's power and the light of heaven and earth. He floated between the vortex and the spherical region. The moment he arrived, he suddenly felt his mind go blank. It was as if an indescribably terrifying existence had forcefully exploded in the depths of his heart, causing a change that far exceeded his understanding. With this emptiness that came from the heart, the independent region suddenly began to distort, and the surface of almost every part of it began to change at this moment. There were depressions, bulges, huge cracks, and shocking distortions like fried dough twist. It looked as if there were billions of terrifying behemoths that were wildly destroying it. And everything that Luo Fan saw from the perspective of the general trend of the fourth level of the Tao Master's Road was even more horrifying. At this moment, the incomparably calm atmosphere that had become incomparably calm due to the extraction of energy suddenly turned turbulent. It was as if a meteorite that was similar in size to the pond had been thrown into an incomparably calm pond. In the blink of an eye, the entire atmosphere had already lost its integrity. It directly collapsed and scattered in all directions, directly turning from a calm state into incomparably chaotic. This kind of chaos was different from the chaos that would have occurred if the power of the general trend had not been extracted. The previous chaos was caused by the chaos caused by the various units within the general trend. In other words, it was the result of the internal force within the general trend. But the current chaos was completely different. The current chaos was simply the result of the violent conflict of external forces. These two differences caused the two to appear similar, but the final results were completely different. The previous chaos would give birth to endless power that could be continuously extracted by Luo Fan and used to oppress his light of heaven and earth. But the current chaos would frantically absorb power and frantically draw back the power of the general trend that Luo Fan had previously extracted to maintain this chaos. In this way, at this time, the entire fourth level of the Road of Tao Master seemed to have been completely connected to a huge vacuum cleaner. A terrifying suction force acted on every part of the fourth level of the Road of Tao Master, acting on every bit of the power of creation, extracting the various powers that were compatible with the general trend and could supplement the chaotic power in the general trend. Under such a change, the entire fourth level of the Tao Master's road seemed to be in chaos. These were only macroscopic changes. Although the impact was extremely far-reaching, it was not something that could be reflected in a short period of time. At this moment, the changes that were happening within the vortex were more direct, and the impact was more direct. When the general trend was suddenly thrown into chaos by the external forces, the only target that the cultivators were fighting for, the seal that represented the highest authority on the fourth level of the Tao Master's road, suddenly emitted countless cracking sounds. The sound was so loud and the penetrative power was so shocking that it directly entered the ears of the cultivators that were originally scattered across countless worlds. No matter what they were doing, countless cultivators could not help but turn their gazes and senses towards the seal. The moment they sensed the seal, a shocking change unfolded before their eyes. Millions upon millions of cracks instantly appeared on the seal. Then, the seal suddenly collapsed, turning from a complete state into endless powder. Under the attack of the many cultivators, it turned into a wisp of smoke that gradually dissipated into the void, and could no longer be found. How could this be? The cultivators' eyes were filled with disbelief, and they were at a loss for what to do. Over the years, this seal had been intentionally or unintentionally attacked by many cultivators countless times. Among them, the most powerful attack was enough to completely destroy a group of worlds. However, all the attacks that they had launched were like a spring breeze to the seal. Not a single attack could leave a mark on the seal, not to mention destroying the seal, but now, under everyone's perception, the seal had completely collapsed and turned into nothingness after being swept by a little bit of power. It was easy to imagine how unbelievable this was to the many cultivators. At this moment, whether it was the meticulous cultivators or the cultivators that only fought instinctively, they all understood that some sort of drastic change had occurred. At this moment, the many cultivators no longer had any thoughts of fighting. The intense competition that they had been fighting for so many years seemed to have become very boring. It felt like they had been in a daze for so many years, and now they had finally woken up from their dreams. Once they regained their senses, the many cultivators were filled with fear. What method could it use to deceive our minds and make us take the initiative to fight such a fierce battle? What is that powerhouse trying to do? What good does it do for him to let us fight like this? Could it be that he is the kind of existence that wants to see the world in chaos, and as long as he sees chaos and battles, he will feel endless joy? This was the second thought that appeared in the minds of the many cultivators. Of course, different cultivators had slightly different thoughts, but the general meaning was similar. The difference between the chaos caused by external force and the chaos caused by internal force was vividly displayed at this moment. Originally, when the internal force caused the general situation to become chaotic, the minds of the many cultivators were unknowingly deceived. They only wanted to obtain the seal, and they were willing to pay any price for it. However, when the general situation caused by external force was similarly chaotic, the minds of these cultivators were completely cleansed. Not only did the original deceit disappear, but they also felt that their minds had become unprecedentedly clear. The various facts that originally existed and deceived their minds were no longer secrets in their eyes. Even the battles that might have occurred when their minds were not deceived seemed to have become insignificant at this moment. The two, obviously formed two extremes. The reason for such a change was actually very simple. When the general situation caused the internal force to become chaotic, and then its power was extracted, in order to maintain the integrity of the general situation, it had to maintain the state of causing chaos in every unit of the general situation. In other words, they had to maintain the state of fighting with other cultivators. Only in this way could the general situation not collapse. And this naturally caused the minds of many cultivators to be deceived by the general situation. Chapter 2272. Compared to the changes in the vortex, outside the vortex, in front of Luofan, the independent domain formed by the battle between the general power and the light of the world had exploded. Everything in the domain had been annihilated in an instant. Endless shock waves were released from it, stirring the surrounding creation power into an indescribable chaos. They turned into layers of waves that frantically surged in all directions. The energy that Luofan had expended a great deal of effort to extract from the great momentum had already disappeared without a trace during this process. As for the light of the world that opposed the general power, it had already disappeared and was hard to find. The place where the independent domain was originally located had turned into an empty space. Or rather, it had turned into the source of the shock waves, constantly releasing shock waves in all directions and stirring the boundless creation power. However, Luofan, who should have been extremely nervous about all of this, only showed an indescribable understanding on his face at this time. He did not show any nervousness because of this. It was as if all of this didn't matter to him. This situation shouldn't have happened. After all, he'd spent so much time and even caused so many cultivators to fall into chaos in the vortex. He'd caused countless cultivators to fight, and it was all for the sake of the most important fundamental transformation of the light of the world. And now, the light of the world had clearly disappeared without a trace. No matter how one looked at it, he should be nervous. However, the truth was the truth. At this moment, he really didn't have the slightest trace of nervousness on his face. He only quietly floated in the middle of the impact of the boundless creation power with a calm expression. Traces of understanding constantly seeped out from the depths of his eyes. This state persisted. Even when the shock waves from the independent domain's destruction gradually subsided and the boundless creation power gradually returned to a stable state, his expression still didn't change, and he was still in that indescribable state of understanding. The various auras on his body also gradually surged at this moment. In a trance, there seemed to be a faintly discernible existence brewing in his body, as if it could erupt at any time and produce an earth-shattering effect. As the shock wave of the creation power gradually subsided, the chaotic situation caused by the external forces also gradually calmed down. From the original chaotic state, it gradually calmed down. Due to this change, the minds of the cultivators in the inner worlds of the vortexes gradually recovered, and various emotions began to surface in their hearts again. "It seems like the transformation is complete," a cultivator muttered, coming to this conclusion. As powerful cultivators who could survive on the fourth level of the Tao Master's path, these cultivators had an extremely deep level of control over their own bodies. If he had been in the same state as before, because his nature had been suppressed, it was naturally difficult for him to detect what was going on. However, once they came back to their senses, once they regained control of themselves and regained their spirituality, there would naturally be no more doubts about what had happened to them. Everything would be completely revealed. "We're free," some of the cultivators asked doubtfully. "Freedom? It's still a long way off." At this moment, the middle-aged rogue cultivator spoke. As soon as he spoke, he attracted the attention of almost all the other cultivators who knew his identity. Strength was the right to speak. The stronger the person, the more people would listen to him. The identity of the middle-aged rogue cultivator from the 5th level of the Tao Master's path clearly represented his great strength, and it also meant that all the other cultivators would definitely pay attention to what he said. "Why haven't we regained our freedom?" a Tao Master's disciple asked in confusion. "Your worlds are still mixed together. Even without that strange control, you can't escape from that person's control, right? How can you talk about freedom?" The middle-aged rogue cultivator said disdainfully at this moment. Hearing this, all the cultivators' expressions changed. Originally, under the influence of the general situation, they were only focused on the problem of fighting each other, but they forgot the root cause that forced them to fight in the first place. Now that the middle-aged rogue cultivator reminded them, they suddenly came to a realization. The root cause was not the influence of that unknown power, but the method of mixing all the worlds together, preventing them from escaping. For a moment, all the cultivators fell into silence. Seeing this, the middle-aged rogue cultivator smiled slightly and said, "Actually, there is still a way for us to regain our freedom. Us everyone." Hearing this, almost all the cultivators showed an inexplicable surprise on their faces. Just like what was mentioned before, strength represented the right to speak. The stronger one was, the greater the right to speak. The more people believe what they say, the more people will listen to them. The middle-aged rogue cultivator's identity as a rogue cultivator from the 5th level clearly represented his strength. Even if he did not say anything specific, it was already enough for the cultivators to have expectations for his words. At this moment, the middle-aged rogue cultivator showed an inexplicable smile on his face, but there was some uneasiness in the depths of his eyes. He did not know if what he said next would go as smoothly as he had planned, or if it would lead to an unimaginable punishment. However, the arrow was already on the bowstring, and it had to be released. Since he had already started, there was no way back for him. Immediately, he took a deep breath and said, "Although I don't know why, that expert obviously has some problems and doesn't have time to care about us. This is our only chance to regain our freedom." Hearing this, all the cultivators were slightly stunned. They looked at the middle-aged rogue cultivator with an inexplicable gaze. Their gazes were filled with uncertainty, inexplicable anticipation, and a faint sense of worry. They were waiting for the expert to descend at any time to punish the middle-aged rogue cultivator. The severity of the punishment would determine how much trust they would have in the words of the middle-aged rogue cultivator. Time passed bit by bit, but the middle-aged rogue cultivator did not change at all. He was still hovering there, looking as mysterious and powerful as ever. "He's right," one of the disciples of a Tao Master said in an incredulous tone. Hearing this, the other cultivators nodded one by one, and their expressions gradually showed a hint of excitement. After all, if what the middle-aged rogue cultivator said was right, then they would have a chance to regain their freedom. "What should we do?" One by one, the cultivators asked at this moment. At this moment, the middle-aged rogue cultivator also heaved a sigh of relief. Although he appeared to be extremely confident earlier, he was actually feeling uneasy. He did not know what kind of fate was waiting for him. Was it boundless hope, or was it endless despair? Although he could not be completely sure, he knew that at least for now, there was still hope for them. Previously, that expert used his identity as the ruler of the entire 4th level to make use of a certain potential in all of us to achieve a certain goal. This means that if we combine all of our potential, we will definitely be able to resist his methods. Therefore, the only thing we can do now is to pick another ruler, a ruler similar to that expert. Then, we will use this ruler to draw out that potential and break the fusion of the worlds. That will allow all of us to regain our freedom," the middle-aged rogue cultivator said. "What happens after that?" some of the rogue cultivators asked doubtfully. Obtaining freedom was naturally a good thing. However, if the freedom did not last long and would soon be lost, then it was better not to have it. Obviously, in their opinion, even if their worlds were to break free from the fusion and allow them to regain their freedom, it would only be temporary. After all, that expert was still around. Even if they regained their freedom, when that expert reacted, they would once again fall into the current situation. Ascend. The middle-aged rogue cultivator said indifferently. Ascend? The eyes of the cultivators either lit up or showed indescribable despair. Almost all of the cultivators whose eyes lit up were disciples of the Tao Venerables. These disciples of the Tao Venerables had originally cultivated in the Tao Venerables' territories. The cultivation environment was so wonderful that it was billions of times better than the rogue cultivators' territories. After cultivating in such an environment for so many years, they had already accumulated an endless amount of resources. Although not all of the resources of the Tao Venerables were enough to allow them to ascend to the 5th level, most of the resources of the Tao Venerables were definitely enough to allow them to ascend, as long as they were willing. In this way, if they wanted to ascend, they would naturally be able to do so. However, this was only for the disciples of the Tao Venerables. For the rogue cultivators, the situation was completely different. For the rogue cultivators, it was only recently that they had obtained their own worlds. Under such circumstances, there were only a few of them who could condense the power of the world group. They were still far from being able to ascend in this way. Using ascension to escape was naturally an impossible task for them. No. All right. The two types of cultivators instantly replied at the same time. Regardless of whether you're confident in ascending or not, don't worry. Since I've proposed this solution, I'm naturally confident in letting you all carry it out, the middle-aged rogue cultivator said. Is there any way to allow those who don't have the strength to ascend directly? The rogue cultivators were very doubtful. Under normal circumstances, this is naturally impossible. However, this is not normal. Right now, all of your worlds are mixed together, the middle-aged rogue cultivator said. Hearing this, many of the cultivators fell into deep thought. The eyes of the quick-witted ones even began to light up. Clearly, they had thought of something. Looks like some of you already understand. That's right, this kind of mixing is a huge restriction for all of you, but at the same time, it's also a kind of opportunity. An opportunity that allows you to surpass your limits and transcend your intrinsic qualities. The middle-aged rogue cultivator said with a smile, with all the worlds mixed together, each world can naturally replace one another, communicate with one another, and interact with one another. This way, as long as you can find existences that walk similar paths and exchange insights, you'll naturally be able to surpass the realm barrier that would normally take countless years to surpass. Hearing this, all the rogue cultivators already had indescribable expressions of joy on their faces. They had always treated this kind of mixing of worlds as a disaster. They didn't expect that, on the other hand, this kind of mixing could also bring them great benefits. Every cultivator's cultivation path was unique. However, the world was only so big, and the essence of cultivation was there. With so many cultivators, there would ultimately be some cultivation paths that were similar in some aspects, and this kind of connection was enough for them to communicate with one another, use each other as reference, support, and strengthen one another. In the end, those with insufficient realms could use this method to increase their realm and reach the level of ascension. Those with sufficient realms could also use this method to strengthen their foundations and even comprehend other things by analogy. Of course, the many cultivators didn't believe everything that others said. At this moment, countless thoughts, countless possibilities, and countless information appeared in their minds at the same time. At the same time, they kept deducing the feasibility of it. In the end, more and more cultivators deduced the results that they wanted, and their faces were all filled with joy. According to their deductions, the middle-aged rogue cultivator's words had almost a 90% chance of coming true. With this probability, all of them were overjoyed, and they couldn't wait to immediately start exchanging insights with one another. The many cultivators began to buzz, and it seemed to be inexplicably chaotic. There was a great conflict between the rogue cultivators and the disciples of the Tao Masters. However, this conflict was nothing in the face of true freedom and true detachment. At this moment, the rogue cultivators began to communicate with the corresponding disciples of the Tao Masters, hoping to seek help from them. The disciples of the Tao Masters were not stingy with their insights when they asked for help. They would almost always grant their requests, but they needed corresponding treatment. The reason for this was naturally not because the disciples of the Tao Masters were of noble character and unquestionable integrity. It was because this also had a lot of benefits for them. Compared to the disciples of the Tao Masters, the rogue cultivators' inheritance was naturally much worse. However, their thinking, their imagination, and the various shining points that they had explored alone over billions of years had their merit. For the disciples of the Tao Masters, it was a great supplement. If they could completely obtain the insights of the rogue cultivators and gain a lot from the worlds of the rogue cultivators, their cultivation would be greatly strengthened, and various details would be greatly improved. Chapter 2273. Seeing that the cultivators had reached an agreement, the middle-aged individual cultivator said, "We don't have much time now, we need to hurry. Now we need to confirm a ruler as soon as possible and use the ruler's authority to speed up the flow of time. Only then will we have more time and our plan won't have any problems." Hearing his words, the cultivators naturally knew what he meant. At this moment, the entire place fell silent. To choose an expert to be the ruler of the fourth level of the Tao Master's path, they naturally needed to choose someone who could convince everyone. In other words, the strongest. As an individual cultivator from the fifth level, the middle-aged individual cultivator's strength was definitely above everyone else's. In this way, whether it was according to reason or according to the middle-aged individual cultivator's own opinion, the candidate to be the ruler was obviously the middle-aged individual cultivator. "I suggest that fourth senior brother be the ruler." At this moment, one of the Tao Master's subordinates spoke up. Hearing this, the Tao Master's subordinates came to a realization and laughed. Indeed, although the middle-aged individual cultivator seemed to be the most suitable, it wasn't that there were no candidates among the Tao Master's subordinates. For a long time, when the fourth level was divided into the territory of the Tao Master's subordinates and the individual cultivators, his status was similar to that of a ruler. In this way, in terms of experience, it was obvious that he was more suitable than the middle-aged individual cultivator. Hearing this, the expressions of the individual cultivators changed slightly. Immediately, one of them spoke up, "No. Your fourth senior brother has been your ruler for so many years and hasn't achieved anything. How can we believe that he will achieve something after becoming everyone's ruler?" With a powerful opponent like Luo Fan in front of them, the Tao Master's subordinates and the individual cultivators could naturally suppress their conflicts and cooperate sincerely. However, when it came to the internal status of each other, the previous conflicts naturally resurfaced. To the many individual cultivators, the fourth senior brother had always been the greatest enemy that oppressed them. Although the middle-aged individual cultivator was from the fifth level and not the fourth level, he was still an individual cultivator. If they could only choose between the two, they would rather choose the middle-aged individual cultivator. Hearing this, expressions of agreement appeared on the faces of the other wandering cultivators. In just an instant, the voices of support for the fourth senior brother had been suppressed to the point where they could no longer be heard. After all, although there were many disciples under the Tao Master, they were still far less than the number of rogue cultivators. The fourth apprentice brother said calmly, "I don't have any intentions of becoming a ruler." His words spread throughout the entire whirlpool, allowing all the cultivators to hear him clearly. Hearing this, the expression of the Tao Master's disciple who suggested for the fourth senior brother to become a ruler changed. He said anxiously, Senior Brother, why do you say that? Only when Senior Brother becomes a sovereign will you be able to use the most efficient method to condense our potential and complete the great cause of our transcendence. The other disciples of the Tao Masters also chimed in. First of all, now is not the time for infighting. Secondly, I don't know how to gather all the potential to allow everyone to transcend. The fourth Senior Brother said calmly. At this moment, he looked at the middle-aged individual cultivator with an indescribable solemnity in his eyes. In the inheritance given by the Tao Master, there were many explanations on the path to becoming a Tao Master. Among them, there was a description of the benefits that could be obtained by using this identity. However, no matter which one of the benefits was, it was not enough for him to use the identity of a ruler to help everyone transcend. Under such circumstances, he naturally did not have much confidence in being able to become a ruler. Because of this, he was even more wary of the middle-aged individual cultivator. I only hope that you don't try to plot anything. The methods of us Tao Masters are beyond your imagination. Once I find out that you're plotting something, the result will definitely be something that you don't want to see. The fourth Senior Brother warned the middle-aged individual cultivator. The middle-aged individual cultivator had clearly expected all of this. At this moment, he did not show any surprise at all. He only smiled slightly and said, "Of course not. You should know that I'm currently in the same situation as all of you. Transcending that person's control is also my goal." Hearing this, the fourth Senior Brother only sneered and said no more. Many cultivators looked at each other, each feeling that their fate had been controlled by someone else. However, it was a pity that even though they felt this way, in the end, they had to do as the middle-aged individual cultivator said, because this might be their last chance. It was not that simple to become a ruler without absolute power to suppress them, without absolute power to make all cultivators revere them from the bottom of their hearts, and without the belief that the other party could control their life and death, as well as everything else. That would require a ceremony of submission, a ceremony that would be recognized by the entire fourth level of the Tao Master's path. However, this was not difficult for many cultivators. After some discussion, many cultivators came up with a simple yet powerful ceremony. Immediately, the middle-aged individual cultivator floated in the void, and the countless cultivators, whether they were under the Tao Master's faction or individual cultivators, all emitted a faint light at this moment. The light was extremely weak. The total light emitted by each cultivator was probably not as bright as a bright moon. However, it was this light that contained an extremely shocking essence. It was a kind of essence that contained the essence of these cultivators' life source. In other words, this light could actually be seen as being emitted from the essence of these cultivators. It was a kind of light that contained almost all of these cultivators' essence. The light appeared, seemingly tangible as it surged ceaselessly through the void. As it changed, it seemed as though an endless amount of things were being created. At a glance, it would appear as though there was an endless amount of light and shadow, an endless amount of matter, wrapping around the cultivators. However, upon closer inspection, one would find that they were actually still light, and they were still illusory and uncontrollable light. At this moment, all the cultivators bowed to the middle-aged individual cultivator and loudly greeted him. At the same time, the seemingly substantial, mysterious and wonderful light emitted from their bodies began to break away from these cultivators and began to rush toward the middle-aged individual cultivator from all directions. In the blink of an eye, it had already arrived in front of the middle-aged individual cultivator and forcibly smashed into his body, causing the middle-aged individual cultivator's body to gradually emit a more and more intense light. This light was extremely mysterious. It seemed to contain the essence of all cultivators, but it also seemed to transcend the essence of all cultivators. It was as if it had nothing to do with the essence of countless cultivators. Even though all of this was the result of many cultivators participating, they still couldn't figure out its profundity. At this moment, the general trend that filled the entire fourth level of the Tao Master's path began to tremble slightly. The general trend that had originally calmed down began to fluctuate again. Among them, the middle-aged individual cultivator became the center of this fluctuation. He became the starting point and the end point of all the fluctuations. Between the starting point and the end point, the general trend danced wildly and trembled in an unimaginable way. In the end, endless power gathered and a huge shadow appeared in the general trend. The shadow was extremely illusory at first, as if it was only a shape formed by the fluctuations of the general trend at a certain moment. It was like the clouds in the sky that occasionally formed various strange shapes during the process of drifting. However, as time passed, as the fluctuations became more and more intense, the shadow also became more and more real. When the ceremony in the fourth level was completed, all the cultivators had already infused the light derived from their life origin into the body of the middle-aged individual cultivator. When the ceremony of submission was finally completed, the shadow had already become extremely real and seemed to be completely substantial, a figure that looked exactly the same as the middle-aged individual cultivator, as if the middle-aged individual cultivator had personally entered the general trend. However, compared to the general trend, the figure was dressed in an incomparably majestic imperial robe and wore a crown on his head. His entire body exuded an unimaginably majestic aura. Every breath and every move he made contained a power that was enough to make any life yield and obey his orders. Floating there, the middle-aged individual cultivator continued to exude waves of aura that shrouded the entire general trend, or rather, the entire fourth level of the Tao Master's path. I finally succeeded. The middle-aged individual cultivator murmured as light began to gradually appear on his body. This light contained the characteristics of the will of heaven and earth. It was like a living creature constantly twisting and changing on his body. Countless heavens and earth, countless worlds, countless spacetimes, and even countless creatures and infinite power were constantly being born under the changes of this light. In a trance, his body seemed to have turned into an endless group of constantly expanding and madly growing worlds in the blink of an eye. At this moment, the entire fourth level of the Tao Master's path trembled slightly. It was as if some kind of huge monster had suddenly appeared in the fourth level. An aura that far exceeded the limits of the fourth level spread endlessly in all directions, directly covering all the cultivators there. It made all the cultivators, whether they were the disciples of the Tao Master, the individual cultivators, or even the fourth senior brother, feel as if they had turned into ordinary creatures without any power and were being closely watched by their natural enemy. Is this the power after becoming a ruler? This is quite different from what was mentioned in the inheritance. Fourth senior brother thought to himself. He had only seen what kind of power one could possess after becoming the true master of a certain layer, from Luo Fan. However, because Luo Fan did not show off his power in front of them, he did not fully understand how powerful Luo Fan was after becoming a true ruler. Apart from this, the fourth senior brother could only guess how powerful this power was from the inheritance that the Tao Master had bestowed upon him. However, the inheritance did not think much of the power after becoming a ruler. It even made it seem like a fake power, and it was said that it was best not to come into contact with it if possible. Because of this, the power that the middle-aged individual cultivator displayed was the first time that the fourth senior brother had personally experienced the power after becoming a true ruler of the fourth level. This power, even if it's fake, is worth pursuing. The fourth senior brother had this inexplicable thought, and he unknowingly felt an inexplicable sense of regret. He regretted not competing with the fourth senior brother for the position of ruler. Although the reason he gave for refusing to compete was not fake, it was not entirely the truth. Although there was no ready-made method, there were many indirect descriptions. If he was really proactive, He only needed to spend some time to deduce the various existing mysteries, and he would naturally be able to use the position of ruler to help all the cultivators transcend. The real reason why he refused was that his strength was not comparable to the middle-aged individual cultivators, and the number of disciples under the Tao Master was not comparable to the number of individual cultivators. If he really competed with the middle-aged individual cultivator, there might not be a fight, but it would definitely delay him. Now that the expert was not sure when he would finish his own matters and have the energy to deal with them, it was naturally best not to waste time. At this moment, an indescribable smile appeared on the middle-aged individual cultivator's face. After suppressing it for so long, I can finally unleash my full power. Smiling, he turned and looked out towards the large cluster of worlds, his eyes seemingly transcending the cluster of worlds and the vortex to see Luo Fan's body, who was quietly floating amidst the boundless power of creation outside the vortex. He was originally an expert from the 5th level of the Tao Master's Road. The means he used were naturally not limited to the 4th level of the Tao Master's Road. It could be said that his true strength was simply the light of heaven and earth that appeared above his head at this moment. Although it was not comparable to the imperfect light of heaven and earth of Luo Fan, it was the light of heaven and earth that was many times more powerful than the power of the group of worlds. However, he had always been under the restrictions of the Tao Master's prison. Once he used a method that surpassed the 4th level, the power of the Tao Master's prison would directly pull him into the Tao Master's prison and completely suppress him. It was precisely because of this that he had not used such a method before. However, the situation was now different. Now that he had become the ruler of the 4th level of the Tao Master's Road, to a certain extent, he had integrated with the Tao Master's Road.